things for you today to go over and discuss. Most of them we've prefaced with some previous information. We've had other discussions on in their basic updates. The first one that I think is probably the most critical and one that we've been talking about for a while is our financing for our water, sewer, stormwater, utility infrastructure projects. A couple of months ago, back I think it was in November when we had a workshop, I had presented to you a list of projects and the costs and things like that. We discussed how to go and get a little bit more precise engineering numbers for those projects, and then to go out and start working on the process of establishing ourselves so we can get bonds. There's basically two ways or two groups that we use to start that process off, and I have them here this morning to give you a presentation on the results that they've had and what they've come up with. The first is a financial advisor. The financial advisor helps us go through the entire process of bonding. Given that if council chooses to do a revenue bond, this will be the first major revenue bond that we do. It's very important to make sure that you get everything done correctly. And those individuals have that expertise and do this on a regular basis, so they'll be able to provide that for us. And then the second group will talk to us about our rate structure and our feasibility for our rates and what our rates would look like if we did whatever kind of bonding for these projects. Most recently, we talked about the projects at our council workshop, and I went back and changed some of our numbers and adjusted things per those conversations. The information that they're going to provide you this morning is based off of the previous numbers. They don't have those revised changes in there. So there is some room for additional changes after the fact. What we're looking for out of this meeting is, one, to give you a little bit of background information on what the two organizations have been doing and what the results are showing, and sort of get a common theme or a consensus on which way council would like to move forward with their bonding. So to start things off, what I'd like to do is introduce David Cheatwood from First Tryon to talk about what our financial advisors have been doing, getting us prepared for the bond issuance.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having us here today. My name is David Cheatwood, and this is Amy Bittner. We work at a firm called First Tryon Advisors. We're based out of Charlotte. We work with cities and towns and counties and water and sewer authorities across Oklahoma and South Carolina, primarily in connection with debt-related issues and some of the capital planning and pre-planning that goes along with that. We met with Michael and Debbie back in the fall, knowing they had some utility system needs on the water, sewer, and stormwater front, and we started that process in terms of what we do, and wanted just to give you a brief overview of kind of who we are, what our role is in this process, and then dive into a little bit of different financing options that the town has available to it. We'll show you some numbers behind that in terms of what our estimated cost at this point in terms of annual debt service, and then we're going to turn it over to Harold Parker, a different individual, to talk about how that impacts your current rate structure. Again, our firm, First Tryon Advisors, we're based in Charlotte, founded about 20 years ago. We have a team of financial advisors that cover the Carolinas and Georgia. Amy and I are based in Charlotte, and we predominantly work with the cities and counties and towns, just with the general infrastructure, and we do a lot of water and sewer. That's kind of our primary focus. We've worked with a lot of towns like you all that have regular, ongoing projects, as well as first-time revenue bond issues to the extent you all decide to go that route. So I have a lot of experience in some of those, say, Greensboro, Monroe, Mooresville, High Point, Sanford, Burlington, Gastonia, and others. Several of those Amy and I have worked on together. From Sanford, that was a first-time revenue bond issuer. Same with Burlington and some others. So have some good kind of experience both on the advisory side. I used to work at Wells Fargo on the underwriting side. I could sell bonds, and so kind of brought all that together, using that experience to help find the best plan of finance. So what's the role of financial advisor? It's really threefold. First, there's the pre-planning aspect of it. It starts with just learning what are the town's short and long-term objectives, what are your capital needs, what do you want to finance, where do you go from here. With that, Amy and I look at the different financing options that are available to the town. You'll see in a couple of slides, the primary ones that we're focusing on are revenue bonds or installment financings, which are what you've done today to fund your water needs. We do things like debt capacity, debt affordability, a lot of modeling of the number side that goes into that. And then we're also helping form the financing team. Should you move forward with the bond financing, you've got things like a bond counsel and an underwriter, and an underwriter's counsel. So we help form that financing team. That's drawing on the experience we have on similar deals. The second phase of that is the actual transaction itself. Once you do all the pre-planning, you've got your plan of finance set, you're then moving on to the actual transaction. You're starting the deal phase. So that involves meeting with the local government commission that approves all bond issues in the state. It involves a big thing is rating agency meetings. To the extent you all issue bonds in the public capital market, those require bond ratings from Moody's or Standard & Poor's or Fitch, and so that's a big role for the financial advisor is to make sure we present the town's information in the best possible light. So particularly your credit rating is one of the primary drivers of the interest rate on the bond, so that's the big focus. And then ultimately, all that steers towards the pricing of the bond issue itself and then making sure it closes in a timely manner. So we kind of help shepherd that whole process along. Post-deal, there's some of the ongoing monitoring, making sure everything is worked right, and keeping in touch with what's going on the regulatory side, and anything that may come up that's of interest to the town that they should be aware of. So there's some of that post-deal work. Ideally, we're involved on all three phases of those. Sometimes we jump straight into the transaction. If it's maybe it's a larger entity that already knows their plan of finance, they've done it several times over. Sometimes we just go straight into the transaction stage. But those are the three kind of general primary functions of a financial advisor when you're looking to finance goods. So I want to start off with just a quick snapshot of the town's existing utility system debt. This is on page 7 here that we have. Today, you all have financed all your water, sewer, and stormwater needs with installment financings, and those are direct bank placements. So you've gone out to a bank, said, I need X amount of money. They lend you that at a set rate. And we'll get into kind of what part of the general statutes in North Carolina that's issued under, but that's what you've done today. You've got roughly $13.1 million utility system debt outstanding. That's in the form of installment financing. We also do have a couple state revolving fund loans or grants. Those are direct, generally low interest grants or loans from the state. So we've got a couple of those on the list as well. You can see the various interest rates that are currently out there, in ranging from 0% for some of those grants up to the high end there is 4.77%. All that's going to vary depending on the time that you issued those or entered into that financing and where the interest rates were at the time. What we've got highlighted here, and I may table that for a second, we've got highlighted certain things that you may end up refunding out of this structure into a revenue bond structure, and I'll go into that a little bit, but that's the reason for the highlights there. On the bottom left, you'll see your current annual debt service structure. Fiscal 16, you're just under $1.6 million. That's principal and interest. And then you see how that declines. You get a little step down in 17, 18, and further step down in 19. That's just given you issued them at certain times. Generally, those are issued on a level debt service basis, like an older style, same payment each year. So that's the reason for that decline in debt service structure. We flip the slide. Again, that's the snapshot on the individual basis of each series, each loan you have outstanding. Again, that's where you can see most of those are on a level principal and interest basis there. Again, we're highlighting certain ones that let's talk about the town's capital needs and financing options available to it. You've got roughly $63 million of needs on the full list, and that goes out, and I'm on slide 10 here. That's over the next several years, and that's broken up into different phases. You've got phase 1, which is about $19 million, phase 2, which was about $26 million, and then final phase 3, $17 million. Wide variety of projects there, water, sewer, and stormwater. So what we're tasked with is, okay, how do you finance that $63 million? What are the structures that are out there? So that's what we can give you on the next page. Just a lot of info here, and I'll just highlight this, but we've got two primary ways to finance this debt. The first is what you've done historically, installment financings. That's where you go straight to a bank and place it with a bank. That's issued under a particular chapter with North Carolina General Statutes. Under that chapter, there's no revenue pledge. You're not pledging your water and sewer and stormwater revenues. Instead, you're putting a lien on the asset that's being financed. If it's a tank, if it's a treatment plant, the bank that's buying that is buying it and taking a lien on that asset that's being financed. So there's no pledge of revenues. You've got the lien structure. The annual debt service is subject to annual appropriation by town council each and every year. Each year you're doing your budget. Hey, I've got this X amount of debt service to pay. These installment financings, you appropriate that in your budget each year. Typical projects you see for this, you think of the ones that maybe are the larger assets, the schools, the jails, sort of governmental buildings, convention centers, stadiums, things like that. You see that a lot under this structure because you've got that hard asset. You may not have a hard revenue pledge behind it or revenues to pay for that other than property tax or something like that. So those are the projects you typically see. You see some of these water and sewer type projects for entities that are maybe a little bit smaller, don't have as much needs, and so it's just easier to go that route than to set up a revenue bond structure. For the installment financing, and that process typically takes 2 to 3 months. The LGC will let you go out up to 20 years to finance that. If you go the bank placement route, which y'all have historically done, that's probably going to be shortened to about 15 years, and that's just because banks generally don't want to lend out 20 years. We've seen most of the banks kind of cap it at 15 years. That varies though year to year. Advantages to the town going this financing option, you pay debt service from any available funds. Doesn't have to be water, sewer, stormwater, ultimately, because again, you're not pledging identified revenue source. You have no rate covenant or additional bonds test. I'll go into that in a second. You do have those on the revenue bond side. And then if you go and place it directly with a bank, you don't have a whole lot of annual kind of continuing disclosure obligations to the bank. They buy it, they hold it, and they send them your financials each year, but that's it. You have nothing above and beyond that. Here are the disadvantages to the town for this financing option. One, it creates a lien on the assets being financed. And that's fine if it's a school or a building identified. Where it starts to get messy is if you've got a water tank pledged here, a treatment plant here, and you've got it all broken up. But at some point, as your needs grow, you're not going to have anything else to put a lien on. Or you may have two things. You may do something back in 2010, and then in 2018, you have another financing need on that same project. Well, you've already got a lien on it, so how do you get a bank to lend to you on that? And so the larger your capital needs grow on a utility system, the harder it is to stay with this installment financing route that underlying need structure. Compared to a revenue bond, potentially higher rates on the installment financing. A lot of that's just given that kind of lien on an asset versus a direct revenue pledge. Many banks are sort of in the public market. They like a hard revenue pledge and a rate covenant and things like that. So that is going to drive down the interest rate on the revenue bond side. I mentioned, certain banks, they may not be interested in going out 15 years, even certainly not 20 sometimes. And so a lot of that depends on market conditions. Are banks today willing to go out 15 or 20 years to match your need? So if not, if banks aren't willing to go out that long, then you get shorter and shorter on your term. That's going to increase your annual payment and make it more competitive on your rate structure. The last point 5 in, blesses all of your bond issues and all issues in the state. Once they see an entity's utility system needs grow, and certainly you all qualify for growing, just given the needs you have over the next several years, they like the revenue bond structure. They steer you towards the revenue bond structure because of, again, of the messiness of the installment financings, and you're stepping up in terms of debt. It's time to think about this setting up a identified revenue bond structure with identified revenue streams. A test that shows when you can, you're stable, the system is stable enough to issue additional debt beyond that. And so there's no hard numbers, no hard and fast. Hey, if you get over $10 million, you got to do a revenue bond. But certainly you're at $13 million, which has been fine from the installment financing to date. Jumping from that to potentially, $20, $30, $40, $60 million, that's where you're definitely going over the revenue bond side from their perspective. Let's talk a little bit about the revenue bonds. Those are issued under a different article in the statutes. They have unlike the installment financing, those have a hard revenue pledge. When you issue those bonds, you are saying, we pledge our water, sewer, and potentially stormwater revenues to the repayment of these bonds. And so that's what bondholders, people who buy your debt, that's what they're counting on. They're looking at your revenue stream for each of those systems and saying, okay, is this revenue stream strong enough? Do I believe in this? Is that going to make me buy this bond? Do I want to buy these bonds given how this looks? In many cases, you fund a debt service reserve fund. That's basically, a little fund that's equal to 1 year of principal and interest that you set aside as just additional security. So you have bad year, really either dry year, really wet year, revenues don't come in. To pay that, you've got a fund set aside to make your payments so you don't go into default or anything. It gives you a year to more or less kind of catch up, adjust your rate structure accordingly. So that's an additional level of security to the revenue bond side that you do not see in installment financing. The other two things on security, rate covenant, additional bond test. So under revenue bond structure, you have a rate covenant, and what that says is that the town will set its water, sewer, and stormwater rates to whatever level is necessary to generate debt service coverage of, typically the lowest level is 1.2 times. And so if you have $1 million in debt service, you all are saying, you're covenanting in your documents to say, I will set the rates to get at a minimum, make sure those cover mine, I get revenues of 1.2 million or 1.2 times my debt service. And so that rate covenant is the central focus of the revenue bond structure. And it's always above, it's not at one time, it's always a little bit above because revenues fluctuate depending on various factors. But that's one of the key characteristics of the revenue bond rate covenant. Along with that, there's an additional bonds test, and what that says is there's a test in the underlying legal document that says we can only issue additional bonds if, and in many cases, you can look at projections and say, okay, we project our revenue to be X, Y, and Z over the next 3 years. Here's layering on this new additional bond series. Can I meet my rate covenant on that? So you have to meet a certain test to issue additional debt. And that's, again, kind of goes back to the LGC. They like to see those protections in there so that you all aren't just getting so heavily loaded with debt if your revenues can't cover it. Because if your revenues can't cover it, where's it going to come from? And then lastly, differentiating it in installment financing is you have no lien on property. So that's what makes it easy to do. Hey, I got some water lines, I've got some stormwater needs, and you can do it all. There's no liens. You don't have to worry about that inside. We see these revenue bonds for water, sewer, electric, natural gas, and stormwater. Typical projects those are a standalone credit. So when we talk about credit or credit rating, what a rating agency would do is look at your town, look at the town's financials, look at the town's projections in terms of the revenues that will be coming in and say, hey, how do these compare to the debt service requirements? And kind of given where all that is, coupled with the general town characteristics, economic activity going on here, they will assign you a certain rating, and that's going to drive your interest rate, as I mentioned. For LGC guidelines, you can amortize your debt up to 25 years, and that's one of the other primary benefits. On that installment financing side, y'all typically go on 15 years. Sometimes you can stretch it to 20. With a revenue bond structure, LGC lets you go out to 25 years. And so, yes, you pay more over time because you're just paying more interest over 25 years versus 15 or 20, but your annual payment's lower. So that's going to help you with your rate covenant and making sure your revenue's going to cover that. With the 25-year financing, that, the installment financing we talked about placing it directly with the bank, the revenue bond structure, 25 years, you're going to go into the public market. You're going to go out and sell those to large institutional buyers, mutual funds, insurance companies, along with just general individuals, mom and pop types that buy bonds and hold as part of their portfolio. So that's the difference. On the installment financing side, you typically just go to a bank, there's one holder. You go to the revenue bond side, you're selling it to, and there could be 100 different bond holders that are out there in the public market. With that comes an offering document, a prospectus that kind of lays out all the account information, all the systems information, so that bond holders, when they're looking to decide whether to purchase your bond, they've got all the information that's out there. So there's a couple other, given these other steps, it's a little bit longer financing process. You've got to make sure all your ducks in a row. There's the credit rating agency side of it, so it takes a little bit longer than if you said, hey, let's just do a bank-based financing and go directly to bank-based. So again, the advantages, you can stretch it out longer, lower payments, again, going back to the LGC, it ensures that your revenue's coming in to service your debt, so you're not caught in a bind at some point down the road where your revenues, you got to go from some other source. Disadvantages, talk a little bit about that extra time. There is an additional upfront cost to get it set up. Certainly the first time, you see that cost go down a little bit for subsequent bond issues, but there is an additional time and cost to setting up a revenue bond structure. And then you've got those things like the rate covenant and additional bond test. Once you agree to it the first time, that's it. It is in place. And so for a revenue bond issue 10 years from now, it's under the same document. So you've got to, that's why you want to spend the time up front to make sure you've got the right structure because you're living with this underlying document. A little bit about the annual. If you go and sell bonds in the public market, you've got to, on an annual basis, disclose certain things to bondholders. They want to know how you're doing. You certainly post your annual financials up there. If there's any sort of major development within the town, if you missed your rate covenant or something, you've got to post that up on a public website there. The municipal securities making board maintain. So there's a few other additional steps just on an ongoing basis that you have to do. You mentioned the rate covenant, generally 1.2 times is the bare minimum. We don't like to start off at the bare minimum. You generally like some cushion over that bare minimum. And so, Darryl will touch on this a little bit, but if the bare minimum is 1.2 times your debt service, revenue is 1.2 times your debt service, you want to strive for something a little bit over that. You want to set your rates and plan for something a little bit higher than that. So, 1.4 times is generally a good target. And again, that's one of the factors that's going to drive your credit rating to what you're projecting coverage level. So you've got that on the revenue bond side, but you do not have that on the installment financing. It's just whatever my debt service is, make sure my revenue is there. Those are the primary ones. You've got a couple other structures under North Carolina law that you can do. And I'll tell you a little bit more on the models we have, but you can always issue general obligation bonds. You put it up on for voter approval on a referendum, let the voters decide whether you finance that debt. If you do that, certainly you can pay it from any source, but it's secured by the full faith and credit and taxing power of the town. That's an option that's out there. Don't see that a ton nowadays. Used to see it maybe some more 15, 20 years ago. Now, generally, it's the revenue bond structure. Again, if that's subject to voter approval, if you've got these needs you've got to do, you've got to, sometimes the revenue bond structure is a better way to go. Something else called special obligation bonds. Those are not subject to voter approval, but you can pledge any available revenue stream other than property taxes. This doesn't generally apply for water and sewer unless you've got some other revenue source that's out there, a sales tax or a franchise fee or something else that's out there. So we don't see this a lot. It doesn't cover these, it doesn't cover stormwater projects. So So those are very low interest rates, good if you can get them. You are pledging the water and sewer revenues. The problem is not all projects qualify. They have a very kind of identifiable list of, yes, we will finance these, no, we don't finance those. So talking with Michael, a lot of the projects that you all are contemplating, they're all mixed up together. They're not really clean. To the SRF folks to say, yeah, we'll do that piece of it. So that's where, maybe you could get one or two projects that way, but if you're going to the well, certainly on a revenue bond side, sometimes it's easier just to do it all. And then with the SRF, there's an application process that's required. You don't know if you're going to get all the funds. It's a little bit lengthier application process and time process and different acts. So that's still one of the negative lines. USDA loans, those are another option that's out there available. Like it's not fit every case. You can go for 40 years, which is great if you're trying to lower your annual debt service as much as you can if you're stretching it out longer. The problem there is you're certainly paying. That's the most costly if you look at it over time. 40 years, you're paying the most for it. You would pledge your revenues behind it as well. You do it as a revenue bond. That also requires an application process, and then there's some other things that you've got to comply with. There's certain demographic requirements you've got to meet to be to have it as an option to begin with. But then there's some other things which Davis Bacon type law acts that you've got to make sure you comply with, so it's not as clean as just saying yeah. So that's a lot of information. I'm going to turn it over to Amy to go through some of those, but I want to pause at this point and see if you all today have any questions on any of those available revenue that are available in the infrastructure.
Would it be your suggestion in one of the earlier slides on the outstanding debt to take that 8.5 outstanding debt and combine it into the revenue bond?
Great question, and I forgot to mention that. Thanks for reminding me. So going back to what I highlighted there, when you do a revenue bond structure, bondholders are buying that, and they are not going to buy it if you've got liens on the water plant, the water tank. And so they don't want to buy it, and then you don't make your payment on that installment financing. Well, they take away a central asset to your water or sewer system, which damages the revenue bond side of your ability to collect revenues. And so in order to do a revenue bond structure, you're going to have to clean up or take out all of your installment financings that are not for, you got a couple out there that are for, a piece of equipment or something, which is not essential to the system. So there's one or two you can leave out there. You can also leave the state revolving fund loans out there, grants. So those 0% interest or those are very low interest ones you can keep out there. What the SRF folks generally agree to is that when you do a revenue bond, they subordinate their lien to a revenue bond structure. They're generally fine with that. You've got to go through that process. But a good point. With a lot of these scenarios, all the revenue bond scenarios that Amy will go through, we are in addition to financing all your new projects, we are refinancing or taking out those various installment financings and converting them into revenue.
Great. So now we'll start to get into some of the results of our analysis and look at some scenarios. And I'll just preface this by saying, when we ran 5 different scenarios, there are probably an infinite amount of scenarios we could run, but for the sake of time, we pare it down to just a few substantive ones. So we started with the scenario 1, which is what you've been doing all along, which is the installment financing route, placing a debt instrument with a bank. We assumed a 15-year transaction, since in the current market environment, that's about, I think, as long as you'd be able to get in the bank market, is what you've been able to achieve in the past. From a timing standpoint, we basically went off the CIP schedule that we were provided, so looking at project needs in the year 2016, 2017, and 2018. So that was our general starting point. Scenario 2 starts to look at the revenue bond structure, and again, as David just mentioned, that also assumes that you would refinance the installment purchase loans that you have outstanding. We assumed as a part of those assumptions that we wouldn't extend any of the final maturities or original maturities of those debt instruments, so we kept those the same as far as the final maturity goes. In scenario 2, we looked at a 20-year structure. Everything's structured as level debt. Scenario number 3, we looked at the revenue bond structure amortized over 25 years, and you'll see how this impacts your annual debt service requirements over time. Scenario 4, we looked at 25 years, and then we start to do a little bit of structuring with the principal and include a concept such as capitalized interest, where you can actually finance some of the interest during the construction period. So while your projects are under construction, tax law allows you to finance some of those interest costs until those projects are up and running and generating revenue for you. So that's a way to alleviate some of the potential rate increases that might be necessary to afford the debt. And then in scenario 5, we looked at basically scenario 4, but then we look at spreading the projects out. One of the characteristics of a revenue bond deal and going before the local government commission is they are not going to allow you to issue debt until you have all your bids and permits in hand. So on the majority of the projects, it doesn't have to be every last project, but if you're taking on a $20 million financing, they're going to want to see that at least the major projects you've got bids and permits in hand and are ready to go. So that may mean that the need for your projects maybe gets spread out a little bit, and that will also help, because you'll see help if to the extent you do need rate increases, it gives you the opportunity to get those in place and be able to afford the debt a little more easily in the future. So when we put together these scenarios, we look at things such as rate impact, and that's something Daryl is going to go through in a moment. Overall costs, so your overall debt service costs, your ability to fund all the projects. So you want to be able to, you don't want to be able to be in a position where you're funding half a project or a part of a project. And then what are the LGC policies and guidelines? So anytime we contemplate, especially when we're putting together a new revenue bond financing, we want to make sure that we're going down the path that's acceptable to the LGC so that they ultimately approve your financing. So scenario 1, what does that look like? You'll see, and it's probably easier to see in your paper packets, but the first column here is the refinance, it's the existing, or this is the installment financing. So under scenario 1, you have not assumed that there's any refunding or refinancing of the installment debt that you currently have outstanding. So that's just your existing installment financing debt. Then we layer on a 15-year financing, bank financing, installment financing for the 2016 projects, the 2017 projects, and then the 2018 projects. And you'll see that your max annual debt service ends up being about $6.5 million under that scenario 1. So then we look at scenario 2, which is your revenue bond concept over 20 years. And you'll see the first column, this is the refinancing portion of your installment purchase debt that you have right now. And then we layer on the 2016 project, the 20... Okay, so that's just the aggregate of the two, of the refunding and the new money in aggregate. Then you've got your future 2017 and then 2018 projects layered on. And you'll see that the max annual debt service that was $6.5 million, now on an annual basis it's only about $5.6 million. So just by virtue of spreading those costs out over a longer period of time, your annual debt service costs have come down.
What's the balance on those kind of bonds? I mean, when it says new money, you're showing us the debt payment. Can you tell us what the amount of the bonds are? $63 million roughly, plus the existing debt, so 73 theoretically.
So you've got whatever the project needs are.
Right, the 19 to 26.
Exactly. And then on top of that, debt service reserve fund, which I mentioned.
Right.
We've got, there's a way to either fund that with all cash up front or buy a policy basically that covers that. You've got some substitutions like policies that limits the amount that you borrow, and then you've got the cost of issuance, your underwriting fees, the underwriter goes out and sells bonds and does that for sales commission. So we've got assumptions in there, but primarily it's your project fund deposit and your costs associated.
So, for example, you've got a total debt service after the total run out on this one of $107 million. We could assume that's roughly 63 in project cost, 10 or so in existing debt, so that's 73. I'm trying to factor in, you have your all-in TIC, is that the total interest?
True interest cost.
True interest cost, okay.
When you sell bonds in the public market, each maturity has a different interest rate, so that TIC is the blended interest rate of all the systems.
Right, so I'm just trying to calculate what kind of interest, and we're somewhere around that, depending on where you're at in the scale, somewhere between 3.5 and 5. Okay.
Each of those are different. You've got first set needs this year. So we've got current market rates plus a little bit of cushion because you're roughly 3 months from being able to lock in those rates. Your next one would be next year at 18. So, who knows where interest rates will go. General thought is they'll start to increase. We've added cushion on each one of those because you don't want to show.
Right, so theoretically, you've gone up like in that last of that 2018, you're probably at still like 6% or something.
So I've got it in there. So that, for instance, that roughly 5% of the 2018 scenario, that's got the cushion built in. I've got roughly 50 basis points or half of 1% in each one. So if you issued all of that today, your 2016, the new money piece, that's in the year. I've got 371 on the 20-year. That's probably more like a 330 or so today, 335. So it's, we've got some on the slides of that, incredibly low cost of money.
Right, and then you factored in on each one of these scenarios, I've read, you factored in some kind of interest reserve carry for a 12 or 24-month period while we're constructing.
Scenarios 4 and 5. These do not have that. You'll see the difference.
Understand that? Okay.
Does that 1.4 reserve fund stay constant regardless of where we are there?
For each series, it has its own function. So if you sold the 2016, it generally goes at your maximum annual debt service. If you would have one for, you have like a $2 million reserve. We've assumed that you just buy a policy, pay up a premium, $34,000.
Guaranteed.
That way you don't borrow that $2 million.
Right, yeah, to cash fund a reserve for the full amount, and particularly in the current interest rate environment where you wouldn't be earning much on that reserve, it makes a lot more sense to buy the policy if the numbers work out. So that's what we've assumed in these numbers. So anything that we're showing you here is fully loaded with anticipated costs that we think are on the conservative side. So hopefully they come in lower. Okay, so moving on to the scenario number 3, this is where we stretch the revenue bond out over 25 years, and here again you'll see your annual debt costs going down from about $5.6 million to $5.1 million here, so another way to bring that cost in. So scenario number 4, that's where we start to look at things like deferring principal for a couple of years. The Local Government Commission has allowed utility issuers in the past to stretch out, to defer principal costs until your construction is build out is over. We're also looking at capitalizing 18 months of interest, so that's built into these numbers as well. So when you start to look at the debt cost, annual debt cost in these first few years compared to the other scenarios, it's much lower in the first few years, and then it does go up to, your max is about 5.7, so your max annual debt service cost is a little bit higher than the previous scenario, but it's at a further out point in time. So again, if you put, if to the extent you increase rates, it gives your system a little more time to get those in place to meet those debt service needs in the future. And then scenario 5, we're capitalizing interest, we're deferring principal, and now we're staggering out the issuances, bond issuances, out over a period of time. So we're looking at a 2016 issue. That stays the same as scenario number 4. And instead of a 2017 issue, you're looking at a 2018 issue, and then the 2018 issue is now a 2021 issue. So we're looking at issuances every other year instead of every year consecutively.
Amy,
Yes.
Can I interrupt real quick? To give you an idea of what that does for the projects themselves, the information that you've been provided with our project list assumes each year we would go out for a new bonding package. However, things like our Phase B project, we're looking at a 24-month construction timeframe. So we will be going out for the next bond package on the next project before we actually finish the Phase B project. And what 5 does, scenario 5, is it spreads that out more consistent with the construction sequence and thus spreads out those payments and lowers those payments in that time frame. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we stop any of the projects or change any of the projects. They just move closer to what it would take to construct them rather than front-loading everything into a 3-year time frame. It spreads it out to a 6-year time frame.
Right, and then to add to that, again, the local government commission too will be very interested in timing, project timing of bids and permitting. So that will be a driver too in terms of when you can actually go and borrow the new debt. So this last page here is really a summary of what we put together. And if you look at the graph on that page, the bars are the installment financing route that you've been on in the past. You can see the annual costs that are there related to that, to the installment scenario versus the revenue bond scenario. The yellow line that's on there, which is this one here, that's scenario number 2, which is your 20-year revenue bond structure. So that ends up being a little bit higher. The dark orange red line is scenario number 3, which is stretching it out to 25 years. You can see the debt service costs going down. And then when you start to get into capitalizing interest, you'll see those debt costs down here. So it gives you a few more years to put in, to get the rate increases in place to be able to afford the debt as you go out further out of here. So Daryl is going to show you what kind of impact this has on the financing model that he's put together, and where the different coverages are with respect to each of these scenarios. But are there any questions on the financing?
Well, on your scenario 2 revenue bond 20 and your scenario 3 revenue bond 25, there's a $11.7 million difference in the aggregate. I assume that's all interest, correct?
Yes. You're paying interest over an extra 5 years. That's interest costs.
And can you explain to me again on scenario number 5? If we're doing project deferral, I would think that would be beneficial to us, but yet it's $4.8 million more than 25-year revenue bond.
Basically, what you're doing is you're setting it up so it pushes that debt issuance out farther, and thus, because you're doing that, you end up having more interest over that time frame. So instead of doing everything in the issuance and locking in our costs and so forth in a 3-year time frame, we're moving it out to a 6-year time frame. That difference in amount that you're looking at is that interest that is needed to defer those payments and push those out.
So what are we benefiting versus the $5 million extra in interest? What are we benefiting from that deferral? From the cost,
Slower rate increase.
just the annual debt.
Annual debt and how it impacts your rate structure.
How often is the interest revisited?
Once it's locked in, once you issue the debt, it's locked in for the life of the issue.
For the life of the term.
Right. So once we get into the transaction implementation phase and you have your credit rating documents ready to go, there'll be a specific day that the underwriter will sell the bonds in the market, and at that point, there's no more risk to the town. The rates are locked in, and they won't. There's no variability in the rates. So
It's a set rate.
it's set rate. And as David mentioned, there's a separate interest rate attached to each of the different maturities in the bond issue that averages out to the true interest cost.
And then once that's determined, are you locked in for additional projects and stuff down the road? Okay.
They're fresh. We're not fresh because you've got your base bond document in place. So the next issues are certainly easier than how each one's got its own.
Okay.
Right, and then the other thing I'll mention too, typically a revenue bond issue in the public market has a 10-year call provision built into it, so there may be an opportunity down the road that if interest rates are lower in the future, you'll be able to refinance that debt at some point. So that may be one possibility. Right now, we're in a pretty, what we would consider pretty low interest rate environment, so maybe a little less likely now, but we've said that in the past.
But that doesn't
Had
matter.
opportunities to refund
If
that,
they're
so-
higher, that doesn't apply, is what you're saying in 10 years.
Right, yeah, unless there's we've seen revenue bond issuers refinance debt in a higher rate environment, but typically, the reason is to fix something in the documents, which is why David stated earlier, it is important to get it right, as much as you can on the front end, so you're not in that position.
Sometimes if you issue 25 of your debt, 10 years from now, you only have 15 years remaining, so you kind of shift it forward on the yield curve. So sometimes even if rates are a little bit higher, you now have a shorter financing that lasts 15 years, and so it's still
The 63 million, remind me what those revised numbers were.
The 63 million included everything that we had on that spreadsheet from the council workshop.
No, but you revised those numbers and brought them down.
Yes.
What was that total again?
What that did was we had talked about two things, primarily the priority of the projects and how much we were putting as a contingency. And what I ended up doing is instead of having our engineer's estimate having a 10% contingency and then me placing a 20% contingency onto it for a total of 30%, we dropped that down by 10%. So it's a 10% contingency for the engineer and a 10% contingency for the town. So the fact that the amount that we need to borrow came down made it so you were able to go and shift projects around and try and get more of the things related to stormwater, like the dredging taken care of first, then the pipe to the ocean, then the force main to Hinneker's Ditch, and take care of those in the first bond issuance. So it was really just changing the priorities and changing that amount.
Okay, but the adjustment and contingency brought the 63 million to where, roughly?
Approximately 61 and some change. And that gave us the cushion to go and move those things around.
And I guess the thought that's floating through my mind, the $63 million, is if a municipality has a $63 million bond for 25 years, some of the stuff we may not have done had we not been able to get the bond, but how does that affect your credit rating and your financeability on other projects over the next 25 years? I would think, as just like an individual person, that kind of maxes you out for 25 years.
Right, on the revenue bond side? Or you
Right.
think
I mean,
of
does that make your
other
credit
projects?
rating worse as a municipality because you owe so much money?
No,
or?
your revenue bond rating is based on the revenue stream related on the utility bond, so it wouldn't impact your borrowing capacity for general obligation projects or other town needs over the years. So, no, when we talk about debt capacity, it's debt capacity within the enterprise system or the utility system. It does not have an impact on general borrowing and your credit on that side.
So to give you an example, at the council retreat, we talked about, well, when we do the analysis on our roads and come back with you with road improvements, those are items that would fall underneath the general fund and not be impacted by the enterprise fund debt service.
Right, and that's because you can set the rates for what you receive to what this service actually treats through the community. So
Yes, that's because you're pledging the borrowing power on the revenue that you will receive in the enterprise fund. You're pledging general fund debt
Right.
on the full faith and credit of the town and the taxpayers.
And that was my other question since you're there. I know I understand you have to, and this is a lot for me anyway, because it's a whole new concept, but I understand you're pledging that particular revenue, not tax dollars. So does that mean that, have you calculated if we are going to generate enough money to cover that bond, or do we increase rates?
That's actually the next section,
Okay.
and what Daryl Parker and Wildan Financial did for us is to take the information that Amy and David did on all of our back financing and how to finance it in the future, and figure out what the rate structure would need to be able to meet those obligations.
I had a couple questions on the bond part. We start off with a request for $63 million, and we ended up not needing all of that, but we've issued 63 in bonds. Do we then take that excess revenue and pay back sooner? Do we reduce our revenue requirement from the revenue stream? Or at what point do we fine-tune the engineer's estimates and our hard construction bids before we borrow more money than we need?
You have multiple options of looking at how much you need, your revenue stream, and your costs for the bonding. For instance, if we were looking at just the first bond issuance, that set of projects, and we were to do that this year, say in June, July, we would need to have all of our bidding results in by May. So we would have to have bid documents in hand to say, this is actually how much we're going to spend, rather than the estimates that we had determined. And then that number can be shifted to say, okay, and I want to put a 10% contingency onto that number for any concerns. That's what you actually finance. So you do have that opportunity at that time to say, oh, hey,
So
with
under this
issuance,
projection, Michael, when we talk about doing a 16, 17, 18 issuance, each of those cycles, we would then be required to have final engineering bids, construction bids in prior to the issuance of bond.
yes, you would have to have all those
So
bid
your
tabulations
numbers
done.
today are saying, based on the numbers we gave you, here's how you'd run out $63 million, and this is what you can expect based on where you think the market rates would be in our underwriting in the process. This is kind of the debt service we would need to look. But each one of those years, we then would come with a final engineered drawings and construction bids and say, okay, here's our hard dollars, here's what we really need. It's not 17, it's 16.5, it's not 26, it's 24, or whatever.
And you also have that point, another opportunity, another bite at the apple to say, you know what, let's defer this project to this one and accelerate this one, and that may change how much you're borrowing. So this was based on those
Right.
project sheets and the schedules that we laid out.
And then to analyze, in your opinion, whether we're financeable as a revenue stream for those type of aggregate dollars over 3 or 4 or 5 years. Okay.
This is for planning purposes.
That's where the LGC's government policies and procedures come into place. They won't let you borrow.
Right.
You don't have those.
And how does the interest rate compare to a regular conventional bank-type loan? Is it
We're comparing the same 15-year to 15-year. Generally, the revenue bond's a little bit lower, just because you've got a hard revenue pledge, you have a rate covenant, you have an additional bonds test versus the other one is just subject, that's sort of subject to annual appropriation, you have to get on an asset. So when you're comparing the same term, revenue bond typically is lower.
And do you have any idea what these additional, I understand the time part, but the additional costs for the setting it up and the bond tests, what kind of cost are you talking about?
Well, we can tell, I mean, the numbers that we've assumed were about $250,000 for professional fees, lawyers, put the documents together, rating fees, all the typical professional fees that go into putting together financing. And that's probably per bond issue would be about that. Per series of bonds, so for each year, because you've got to pay all the professionals to. First time, this might be a little bit more just because there's more on the setup end. And then there's also an underwriting fee, so to pay an underwriter to sell bonds in the market and to compensate them for getting those into investor hands. There's a per bond fee on that side. And then there's your cost of funding a surety bond for if you had a reserve fund.
Is all that assumed in your numbers here?
Yes, all of that's built into the numbers.
At what point do you make a calculation whether we're marketable in the bond market? whether these bonds are sellable at those kind of rates?
This is what Daryl's going to show you, making
Okay.
sure, because when you go to get these rated, you're going to have to show them, here are projections, here's how we plan to cover this, here are projected coverage levels.
Okay.
That's taking these numbers, dropping it into the model, to show where.
It's going to tell us where our rate structure needs to be to our customers.
Where your coverage is, because your coverage is something that drives one of the primary factors in the bond rating. And so really, once you see that and the town council settles on here's the rate structure we're going to adopt, that's where you go. You want to go to a rating agency when you have all that in place, so you can say, this is how we're going to pay for it. You go there and say, oh, yeah, we might raise rates, but you're not showing that, then they're not going to, they got to see that.
Is that before or after the $250,000 expense?
So generally, you get the bond rated roughly 3 weeks or so before you actually sell it. So if it's a 3 to 4 month financing process, you generally sell those bonds kind of in the fourth month or towards the end, so you get that rating 3 weeks ahead of time. Now, in a lot of cases, professional fees, in many cases, you work at risk just to, assuming bond deal closes, you get paid out of bond proceeds. And so, in many cases, the rating agency side, which is at the kind of the latter third of the financing process, once you get it rated, you are on the hook for those fees and pay that rate fee. But in many cases, the professional fees, they work at risk until it closes. I want to speak for everybody, the other lawyers and things involved, because there is a lot of, in this case, a lot of upfront work to get the base document and everything in place. So we'll speak to them, but generally, wait till you close these
The professional fees aren't the lion's share of that fee cost, though, are they?
Of that 250?
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah, that is.
All the 250?
And rating fees, which are, I mean, the rating fees for these are probably $50,000 right there. So there's that, you have a bond counsel, you have financial advisor, you have feasibility consultant, you have the underwriters council, so you have a lot of.
And most of those work at risk based on, and then they get paid out of proceeds. So there's some hope on their part as the professionals that they're not doing, they're going to look at this quickly and say, this is a flyer. These guys are workable or they're not.
And the only difference in this situation was because this was our first time doing or considering a revenue bond, I've basically allowed the consultants to do their work and agreed to pay them out of the bonding that we would pay for instance, Phase B, to do the upfront work to show you all of the financial information behind it before you got to a point where you said, I want to do an installment or a revenue. So we'll end up paying that out of however we handle the bond financing for the next segment of bonds, whether it's installment or revenue. And then the rest of the issuance after that point will all be rolled into that bond issuance. So
If the first one is the most difficult and time-consuming, why do the subsequent issuance cost about the same?
they go down, but not significantly. The background work that these folks are doing here, that is used for the next issuance and the next issuance. They just add on to it. So it will go down, but for planning purposes, we assume a flat rate across the board. Just for planning purposes, very similar to what we were talking about for the type of projects and when you do it and all that kind of stuff. We're trying to plan for one number, hoping to have lower numbers when we go out for the actual loans.
So it's really going to come down to what the rate is that we can, how palatable a rate increase over a period of time is for us.
Yes,
As a council and a community. That's what it's going to come down to.
Basically, once we get done today in this explanation, there's basically 3 questions that we kind of need to have settled. And one is, what kind of financing do you think you want to do? Installment or revenue? Schedule of projects and your fee increases. And those last 2 fit hand in hand, because I'm sure that if you drop a project off, your fee increases aren't going to need to be as large. So in scheduling your projects and when you do your loans, that can affect your rate increases and so forth. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, if we can move to Daryl Parker from Wildan to have him talk about the rate analysis and how this financial analysis impacts our rate structure for water, sewer, and stormwater, and then we can add some more questions onto that.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
And you probably know the answer, Michael. For a revenue bond, is there a certain amount that the bond has to be? Does it have to live within X to Y amount of money? Or?
Not,
It's just when you exceed a certain amount, it becomes more costly.
yeah, not really.
Yeah, just definitely no maximum other than what you can afford.
But a minimum.
Yeah, or,
And there isn't anything that you can pin the LGC to either. I've attempted that to say, okay, if the amount is this much, then I go to revenue bonds. No, I won't do
I was trying
that.
to wrap my mind around where is that number.
Yeah, and there's really no good.
and at some point, the cost, the setup cost of the professional fee side, set
Right,
up,
right. Yeah,
Outweigh.
that's what I was
that
wondering.
would be, that comes up to somewhere around, say, $5 to $10 million. Once you get to start, when you start borrowing and amounts over that, a public issue revenue bond tends to make a little more sense.
Before we move into this, I know we lost Steve real quick. Do we want to do a little break and then have Daryl? Couple minute break, and then we'll have Daryl come back and we can set him up. Thank you.
Incorporate the capital projects, the funding scenarios that we're talking about today. I'm not going to get into the details of the rates and the rate study. We're going to kind of look at a big picture flyover right now, because the ultimate outcome for your rates is going to depend on really kind of which direction you go. But what we can look at is the general impact, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So we're not going to really dig into the details of rates and rate structure, just overall financial impact. Now, after the rate study is completed, it'll kind of roll right into the financial feasibility process, which is what Amy and David were talking about when you're doing that initial setup to issue your debt. And so the financial feasibility report, what that will do, and here again this is associated with the revenue bonds, that'll show the bond market and the rating agencies the 5-year financial projections. It'll show things like debt service coverage, which you heard about. It'll show the revenues, the expenses, that kind of thing. So what our purpose is, we don't really have a vested interest in whether or not you do projects, when you do projects, whether or not you issue bonds or installment loans. What we're here to do is help you guys see the financial picture of the decisions that you make moving forward. So with that, there we go. What I did want to show first off, and we're just going to look at a lot of pictures here, what we call kind of the first option is status quo. Just if you don't do anything, just kind of stay where you are. You're not issuing any debt. You're not changing your rates. You're not doing any major capital projects. You're doing maybe some maintenance projects out of your existing reserves. Not issuing any new debt or anything. So what we see right now, the blue bar is your water. Now, what this is revenues, less expenses, less existing debt, transfers to the general fund, any other transfers, the bottom line balance that falls out of a cash flow statement.
Net revenues, after all expenses.
After everything, yep.
That's what we're adding, theoretically, that's what we're adding to our fund balance every year.
Or taking away from your fund balance, yes. So you can see the zeros at the top. So everything is pretty negative right now. The blue bar being the water system, and we look at each system separately. The green bar being the sewer, and the brown bar being the stormwater system. That yellow line is the combined. Right now, on a combined basis, you're not generating enough revenue as it is, and so you would move forward if you didn't increase rates at all. You're going to eventually run out of cash is kind of what that's going to show.
Daryl, I can see a question popping up on that one. The reason for that is the fact that we have been doing more maintenance activities for the past couple of years. So, for instance, things like the $70,000 improvement that we did to the fencing around the wastewater treatment plant. That was a budgeted item, but the way that we had to pay for that is to take that out of fund balance to transfer it into the budget so that we could perform that work. So those maintenance aspects that we've been doing and trying to catch up on for the past several years is what makes this an entirely negative screen.
But those are one-time expenses. They're not
They're
really projected out over.
They're one-time expenses at this point. Looking forward, we only look a year or so forward, but for the purposes of the graph here, he's assuming the same level of maintenance would have to apply for the next 20 years. Now
Michael,
that's,
at the end of last year, what did we add to the fund balance?
I don't know. I would guess at somewhere around $800,000.
We added to the fund balance.
Yes, I would
So,
guess.
Okay. In other words, this gives us a little bit of a distorted picture, because it was our understanding, or at least my understanding, that our revenues were in excess, our rate revenues and fees that we were generating out of the enterprise fund were in excess of our expenses, other than the one-time expenses that we were taking out of capital reserves like fencing, to the tune that we have built up a reserve account somewhere in that 90%. We've spent that down now, but we've been adding $400,000 to $800,000 to our reserves every year. So this presentation tells us we're actually drawing out of our reserves $1.2 million every year.
Which is
That's what we would project moving forward.
Which is true. We do
17,
that.
Does that include the new bond?
That is-
Debt service?
Not yet.
Let me,
This is existing.
this is existing. And what you have to understand is what you're talking about is audited numbers at the end of the fiscal year. How much money we actually brought in, how much expenses we actually had, and the remainder. What this is showing is budgeted planning numbers for the next several years. So to look at it saying, we have to go and bring in money from fund balance every year to balance our budget, which is the normal operating cost plus our maintenance. That's what this is. So it's two different aspects, and you can't compare apples and oranges in that regard.
Okay, well, I'm just going to have to go back to Math 101 then and try and understand that, because at the end of the day, we're going to end up talking about a recommendation to increase our rates.
Yes.
And if we start off at $1.2 million in the hole, what I'm hearing is, if we don't do anything, we need to increase our rates.
Yes.
And I find that hard to understand, because we've been adding to our fund balance every year.
And that is because the difference between actual at the end of the year financing, how much we have collected and what we have spent, and what we budget for. You're always planning on numbers that are going to be slightly higher. So, for instance,
Yeah, but I'm not going to plan that way, Michael, to the tune of $123 million in payments over 25 years. So, okay, well, keep going, I get it, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around why you would show us drawing $1.2 million out of our fund balance every year when we're adding money to the fund balance. And I understand that we've been doing some capital programs, one-time expenses.
mainly because I don't want to lie to you and say that in 2 years I'm going to stop doing maintenance. So I would much rather say,
The maintenance has been in that annual budget.
but not to the tune that we have been spending maintenance money.
Yeah, but when we went through our retreat the other day, and Gil gave us a report of the things he had done, for example, and he listed almost every lift station, and you commented, he's listed almost every lift station and replaced pumps in almost every lift station for the first time in 15 or 20 years in some of those. We're not going to do that every year.
No, you're not. So there is an excess that you have that will change the actual amount that you will need to change your rate by.
I guess I'm trying to understand,
If
if
you-
we've been spending $1 million, just theoretically,
I
if we've been
got it.
spending $1 million a year in maintenance on things that haven't been maintained in the past, by doing pump replacement or pipe replacement like on Florida Avenue, we're not going to do that next year.
I can't guarantee that. There are other maintenance items that we haven't even touched yet.
I think what he's, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but understanding the current condition, especially stormwater, and heck, for that matter, I guess even water and sewer, I would be probably in his shoes too. I would be wanting to tell you a better story at the end of the year than having to come back for a budget adjustment to try to cover something that happened.
I understand, but we're talking about borrowing $63 million to do a lot of those deferred maintenance items with total replacement. And we were just told that now that we've done phase one, we should have 50 or 60 years life expectancy out of a phase one with the new pipes and the new stormwater. So I'm just trying to wrap my arms around how we start with a projection that's ultimately going to affect our rate. If we're already $1.2 million in the hole and you want to add $5 million to that, that's $7 million over a period of time. I mean,
You have to choose certain assumptions, yes. And the assumptions that we've chosen in this case is that our current budget, the 2015-16 budget that we have, will be continued on in future years, just the way that it is. If you'd like us,
we'll have that discussion
if
without
you,
wasting all these guys' time.
if you'd like to have, come up with an arbitrary number to say, okay, this is it, then we can do that and change the numbers, most definitely. But that's something you do after you get the initial work done.
Michael, let's just take that 1.2 million in 17. That's apparently drawn from 16. So how much did we spend in 16 on maintenance, approximately? Was it? Is that-
Additional maintenance topics,
Right, other than operation.
somewhere right in that $1.2 million, and part of that was water, sewer, and stormwater.
So in our discussions in the last budget cycle, I think Steve's basically referring to where we talked about where are we rate-wise versus the projects, our current debt service. Well, if we do it this way, we're not really looking at any substantial rate increases for a couple of years, and we're able to cover our debt. That was not based on $1.2 million worth of maintenance that year. That was, or a projection of that over the future years.
That is, but it's only for a couple of years out. So, for instance, we'll take, when we do the budget, we'll look at what our actuals were for the past year. We'll look at what we need for the next future year in maintenance, and that'll become your budgeted dollars that you would have. At the end of the year, we say, how much did we actually spend and how much did we take in? And that makes that number change. So we may bring in more revenue, and we may not do as many projects. We budgeted for them, but not actually expended those resources.
Well, we can talk about it, like Steve said, later, but really it's the same as the contingency issue. It's a determination how much you want to build into the budget over the next years. And it may not be $1.2 million every year. It might be
just
$300,000.
Just like in the previous conversation about what information you need and what things can change before you actually issue the bond debt. The bond debt will change the amount because of those bid results, right? Same thing takes place each time you do a bond issuance. You look at this and say, okay, where are you now at this scale? If in 2 years we drop $1 million out of our maintenance budget for these three entities, it's possible that there's only a $2 million or $200,000 shortfall. Those calculations are done at the time that you do the issuance. Right now, all we're doing is planning as if today goes on every day after this.
So I'm all right with that discussion, but at some point, Michael, what's going to happen is you're going to, in about 10 minutes here or less, we're going to hear a rate increase that's going to start substantially jacking up, and we're all going to have heart palpitations saying
Yes.
there's no way we can afford that.
Just like the heart palpitations you had 2 years ago when I did the analysis. Exactly the same way. Yes, sir. We just need to let this gentleman get through that presentation before you make decisions on how to go forward with this.
And all of these numbers are subject to being refined, too. I mean, we're working with Debbie and making sure that, and we've got some pretty conservative assumptions built into these as far as growth in O&M and that kind of thing. So the reality may be different, obviously, than projections, but we're looking at kind of order of magnitude right now is where we're trying to get to. just look at the picture and how these different options are going to impact kind of what we're currently seeing.
It's a baseline you've worked from here on
Exactly.
the rest of these examples.
Exactly. So we'll move forward. So, I mean, we don't see this as the scenario. We just see this as an option. I mentioned we're doing a rate study, and we're not going to get into the detail of that right now. That's for another presentation, and I'll be back to see you guys again probably in a month or two for that. But we have identified some rate structure changes that if you did nothing else and just changed some of the rate structure, and by structure we're talking about, for example, right now your base charge includes 3,000 gallons of flow. You're kind of giving away that first 3,000 gallons of your water service. So what we're proposing is kind of phasing that out to where you have a base charge that's just a base charge that pays for availability of service. As soon as you turn on your water faucet, you start paying for the flow. So just doing that is going to significantly increase the revenues and improve your financial picture. So here again, we'll talk about that in more detail. But this is still without the new debt yet. So let's move forward and add those capital projects in there. This is, as you heard, the first option is to continue financing the way you're doing it now with the installment loans. And what we've looked at here now, we've talked a little bit about rate increases. What we've done, and here's just put in 10% a year over that 5-year period. And you've got the financings at fiscal 16, 17, and 18, just like the options that you've seen from First Tryon. And you can see that even with the rate increases, that 15-year installment plan is going to have a negative impact, and it's short-term financing basically for long-term capital projects. If we look at the 20-year revenue bond scenario, this is where we looked at what Amy had shown with just without any deferred principal or anything, say, creative. So we're looking at still the same rate increases, just shifting the bond out from a 15-year financing to a 20-year financing improves the financial picture. Still doesn't get us where we need to be, and you'll see that. We talked a little bit about debt service coverage. This graph, what this is showing us, that black bar is the minimum requirement of 1.2 times. That's our assumption. Which it would probably be at least 1.2, maybe 1.25 at the most. We put the red dashed line in there as a target of 1.5. David had mentioned 1.4. We've just set that a little bit higher for presentation purposes.
So, just so I understand what I'm looking at here, the blue lines would show us what our revenues are.
What the coverage is, which is
right.
Revenue less O&M divided by the debt service.
Right. And those blue bars reflect those structural adjustments you talked about, going to a base fee and then getting first gallon charge, plus a 5-year 10% annual increase.
Yes, sir.
And so by 2021, we're still at 90%, or 90.95, not even a 1-to-1 debt coverage. With a target at a 10% increase.
Right.
On this 20-year bond. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're still short of the money, even if we increase rates 10% every year for 5 years.
Exactly, with a 20-year bond scenario, and that's part of what we expect to see, that as we move that funding out to a longer term, as you saw the payment amount, the maximum payment amounts go down, and what we can also do is shift the timing of some of that, and that's what we'll look at next. If we look at the 25-year. You can see that just making the extra 5-year adjustment from a 20-year bond to a 25-year bond for each of these. This is still assuming fiscal 16, 17, and 18 that there will be the bond issues for the $60+ million in total, and so that we start catching up at least there. Here's the coverage numbers for that. Still not getting where we need to be, but definitely improving. Now this is the final option. What this shows is if we do the increases, but we're doing the alternative financing where we're using capitalized interest to take care of the payments while you're doing construction. And there was discussion of that, and some deferred principal to kind of let your rates catch up. Then you can see we actually we get back to where we need to be for the most part. Coverage is still going to be a little bit tight in that last bond issue. So that might be an area where we'd have to kind of, let's say, refine our adjustments, our projections. The final option is, let's say we extended those bond issues out. Here again, what you heard earlier, instead of 16, 17, 18, we're looking at a bond issue in fiscal 16, fiscal 18, and then again in 21, the final year of our projection period. And as you can see, that significantly improves the financial picture. And from a debt service coverage standpoint, we're meeting coverage every year and either hitting or getting close to our target every year on that. So I know you've got questions.
No, I'm fine. I mean, I get it.
No,
I get it.
And as I mentioned, this is really kind of, we're looking at order of magnitude right now, and just we wanted to give you kind of a basis for comparison.
And that's based on the $63 million in project budgets that got us to $123 million.
Yes,
coverage
that's exactly
over a period
right.
of time. And that's based on our current, last year's operating and that's capital.
Right.
One-time expenses, so whatever.
The current budget,
Right.
kind of projecting forward from that, yes, sir.
Okay.
Other questions for Daryl?
Well, we'll be here a
guess
little
we
bit
could-
longer, so if anything.
I guess we could extrapolate from these a little bit. If we decided it was going to be $600,000 a year versus 1.2, we can just.
Well, and that's why I guess my question
Well, and-
would be, how hard would it be if we come back and said, show us what we can afford if we do a 10%, if we do the structural adjustments in the 10% annually for 5 years, what can we afford? If it's not 63 to get to 120, 1.2, is it 33? Is it 53? Can you give us some understanding so that we can go to Michael and say, Michael, we're either going to have to defer some of these projects, we're going to have to reprioritize, or are we going to get comfortable at 10% for 8 years, or are we going to do 4% for 4? I mean, those are the rates that we're going to have to talk about. But we got to give Michael something, and then.
And that's why I mentioned those three things that we would need to go and get to, and that is, do we do installment or revenue? In my estimation, the answer is relatively easy because the LGC is not going to let us do installments at the amounts that we're talking about. So really, the only way to handle it is a revenue bond issuance. You need to look at whether that is spread out over 2 fiscal years, making 6 years, 3 issuances, or whether you want to consolidate them all into 3 one-year issuances. Okay. And that changes the scale. So in my estimation, if I was to make a recommendation, I would say the best approach would be scenario number 5, where we do it in 2-year increments for our debt financing, 16, 18, and 21. Defer the payments, the principal, the interest, do all what they said in option 5 or scenario 5, and that spreads that out for that $63 million in those projects. That would mean that we would have to do 10% per year on our rate increases for water, sewer, and stormwater to do those projects. At that point, now we have questions of how do you want to go and push those projects out? Do you want to change the schedule?
And I would like to look at a couple. I would like some other numbers to help me understand more clearly.
And
some basic numbers, Michael, for example. What is our average bill to a homeowner? And therefore, if we did a 10% on average bill for water, sewer, and stormwater, if it's X and we increase that 10% over 5 years, what would that be?
Currently, without the rate structure, without the changes to the actual rate structure that Daryl talked about, correct? right now, giving away the first 3,000 gallons, that whole scenario, exactly the way it is now.
I think we could do is model it both ways.
Okay.
If you could. I mean,
What I
that's
was
what we
hoping
have
for.
currently,
Well, we're looking-
without the structural change, and then add 10%, and then do the structural change and add 10%. I'd kind of like to understand how much Dan's bill is going to go up every year, or how much DA Lewis's bill is, because I'm sure that'll be the next phone call.
Well, I think what we're looking for is to understand, like in our text, I mean,
Right.
what's 1 cent get us? How many, is that $100,000, $120,000? And I know it's a little difficult because residential and commercial are handled, are not the same animal, but
Get us a benchmark to start understanding.
and-
For me, I mean, I don't know, but, and then from there, aggregate-wise, what do those increases yield as far as revenue that gets us at a 1.2? If the bond market tells us we have to have a 1.2 debt coverage, and our target's 1.2, we'd really like to target 1.5. What is our borrowing capacity if we do that 10% increase on option 4 or 5? I mean, I'm kind of personally looking at 4 or 5, right? Anytime you got to borrow cap, I mean, it's just, we've been in a hurry to do these, but it's the structured payment, so that's a couple of numbers I'd like to understand. We can debate later how close your 63 is, or if we're really drawing down $1.2 million out of capital every year. I get those variables. You got to start with something. I agree. You got to have a benchmark. That's the benchmark you were given.
And that's the kind of thing that I need to be able to bring back to you. Those two items. The other one that I think is a great example of the difference between planning a budget and actual what you receive at the end of the budget and your final accounting is that aspect of how much do we think we will be pulling from fund balance. We can change that number left and right. Now, what that's going to do, arbitrarily changing that number, is restrict what Gil is going to be asking for instance, in water, sewer, and stormwater for maintenance. He's going to say, ooh, this year we only can pull in this much money from fund balance to do these maintenance aspects that we didn't know we needed to do last year.
I guess
so we can come up with that number.
At some point, then, we need to have a clearer understanding and some time with Gil to understand a 5-year projection of what he really thinks
maintenance.
these huge maintenance issues are, Michael, because, you're
the
talking...
big ones we should kind of know about.
Right.
Well, and
I mean, it's
you
the
do.
difference
That's
between-
what we're financing is the big ones.
Right.
It's the things like, and Fred was here. It's the things like the stormwater improvements that we have to do to fix Fred and Mary's stormwater drainage issues.
But that should be in the bond issue, not in a maintenance.
If they come up mid-year and we don't have the ability to put it into the bond and we have to fix it now, it becomes a maintenance aspect.
Okay,
But,
for
yes,
example,
you're
on
right.
Fred, for that specific example, we're not fixing it mid-year. We're waiting until we have my understanding was we were waiting until we had 1B ready to go and finance that. And you guys have come back and said that you are now analyzing each one of these phases, and you hope you have it closer to 95% captured of all the miscellaneous things we missed in the first phase.
Yes.
So I'm anticipating we have much fewer surprises. My question is the difference between changing my oil every 3,000 miles and rotating my tires, that's maintenance. Replacing my engine once every 10 years ain't maintenance. So when you're spending $1.2 million and you call it maintenance and we're buying a fence around Matsu, that's not maintenance. Replacing the pumps every 15 years, that's for me, that's a little different than he's got a skater problem and he had to go, have a guy come out and work on it, or the backhoe broke. And so I'm having a problem with understanding what you're classifying as maintenance. If we're borrowing $63 million, Gil better have almost everything he needs in there, other than tell me what maintenance items he's thinking $1 million a year.
And I think that's very much doable, and one of the things that we need to get out of this conversation so that we can get to a more accurate number.
To simplify it, that was pretty simple, but it was like, we've known for a while we had to redo our lift stations, so that wasn't a surprise. So what other type of projects like that do we have?
I understand.
And just to piggyback a little bit on what Steve's saying, and I totally agree with that. But if we're going to pledge these funds and we can only use these funds for certain things, I think we need to know how they're generated, who's paying what. And I can tell you there's a big difference between commercial and residential. And we got hit hard commercially on stormwater fees and things like that. And I want to know, I want to see those broke out separately. You know what I'm saying?
I
This
do,
was just last year.
I do, I'm just thinking about it. but
Okay,
yes.
just
Well,
last year.
Stormwater, water, sewer is what you mean by broken out.
We need to see it broken out if we're going to increase everything by 10%, because they were hit pretty hard last year. I know my bills have gone up substantially, and I've heard it from a lot of commercial businesses around town. But how are they generated? What rate are we at, and per what? How do you calculate it? I mean, give me the 101, and then we'll go there fast, you know? Help us understand how you get the number.
That's why we have workshops like this, so we can have this dialogue and make sure that
Because
I'm
we
getting you
need
the
to
right
be able to be
information.
thinking, okay, wait a minute, we're not going to generate enough money.
Michael, I think you're on the right track, and I understand you have to start with
Yeah.
baseline. I think you guys are doing great. These are the numbers we needed to understand and hear. It's generated a few more questions.
Are there other things that you can think of outside of those items that we need to bring back to you?
Well, I think, I still have questions about the 63 million. I mean, if we took 63 million and we adjusted 15% contingency out of it, how do we get to 61 million? I mean, I just think we need to look at those numbers a little bit and make sure see how that was adjusted.
You mean your math doesn't say
Where we are.
$4 million is 15% of 63?
And I understand, and I'm doing some of this math off the top of my head. So, yes, you're correct. It may have been 57 million. I don't
Okay.
know.
Yeah, I don't-
For whatever reason, 61 sticks in my head.
Sounded good.
So I can bring that back to you and show you what the changes that we did at the workshop or at the retreat did to that schedule.
Okay.
That's easy enough.
And I know this is a workshop, not a regular meeting, but we have a citizen with a question. If you want to come up and ask, Wayne, come on up. Wayne.
This is the George Bush philosophy, the shock and awe. I've determined that's from Michael's Adam.
We got an issue at 502 Green Court. My name's Wayne Gunner. It also falls on the next street over there at Ocean Ridge. My neighbor behind me, Betty Lovingood, sank almost waist deep in her backyard the other week because she was coming to meet me at the fence and she disappeared. I thought I was going to call the fire chief who's going to get her out. I've got a sinkhole in my yard. She's got one in hers. Roger Schumacher's fence, my fence, her fence is all falling down. Gil and Brian and all them, they've been over there several months ago and put barrels back there. So, haven't heard nothing else. So, it's getting dangerous because she just adopted a little child. If he comes out in that backyard of hers and he goes down underground, we're going to have a death.
Wayne, I can give you an update on that if you'd like. Council at last month's council meeting adopted a budget for us to go and fix all of the sinkholes that we had that came from the October storms and all the wet weather that we've had. Now that we have an established budget, we can go back in and make those corrections instead of just a temporary correction of barrels and gravel. We can go in and start replacing that and fixing them permanently so that's not there. So you should see the crews out there in the next couple of weeks going and getting to all those stormwater sinkholes.
Okay, it was just up because when she went down, and I'm a former firefighter here with my Iowa, blessed with the county after 33 years of it. And when she was coming to meet me at the fence, and then she goes almost waist deep in the ground.
It definitely becomes a safety issue, certainly.
Yeah, and I was worried about her small child she adopted. I ain't worried about me. I'm so ugly. I'll take it.
And I know that that your particular issue is one that's on that list, so.
Okay, but I just want to bring
Gil,
it up.
yes, sir, Gil should be back in touch with you on
All
this.
right, but I think y'all are going to be the best crew there is, and we have a good chief, and a good chief. They'll let me get a hat from them since I retired. But God bless all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, for bringing that to us.
Yes, sir.
I have just a little bit of, or a couple of comments, and one is I guess the other thing I'd like to know is when we add the 63 million or 61 million projects, how that's going to affect our maintenance of those those things that we complete, and how much that's going to add to it, and how much that's going to affect the general fund side as far as projects that won't be in this, like the roads, which are connected to this water and sewer, what that structure is going to look like, because we're not going to go through the bonds with that, and so how do those balance out?
I can give you a little bit more update on that offline if you like, and what things are included in those bond projects compared to what isn't. And we've done that for council a couple of times now, and with you being new, I can definitely do that for you.
Yeah, I don't want any of the hidden costs.
Certainly. Neither do we.
And that's a good point, Tom, because I saw there was a waste treatment facility and things like that, and $4 million for that in that budget. There will be additional maintenance for those items.
Certainly. There's additional maintenance for new items, and then typically you see some reduction in maintenance for new items also. So if you repair and replace things.
We'll save money somewhere.
Very much so.
What's the timeline, basic timeline from the time we say, okay, here's what we'd like to do till we get to where we need to be?
At this point, what we have been working towards is trying to go and have bids in hand by May 1st so we can go to LGC and talk with LGC. They know about this. They've already been consulted on this multiple times. But go to them and have it reviewed by LGC. That's a 30-day turnaround time. June is when we would have an answer out of them. We'd come to council with another resolution and then go out for bond issuance in June, July. So what our interest is right now is between now and May. These folks have done a lot of upfront work. At this point, we need to either two options in my mind. One is schedule a special meeting just for this topic between now and the next council workshop in February, so that we can address this particular issue specifically, or push it off to the February workshop. I would prefer not doing that because it's going to push back the time frame that we have.
Okay. Any idea what the timeline for the bond, from the point that starts until it's funded?
Once you say go on revenue bond structure and we have a ducks in a row to present this to credit rating agencies, it's roughly a 3 to 4 month process. So that's kind of leads up to make your decision at some point in February, time for the bids coming in. So that gets you to that June, May, July timeframe, 3 to 4 months.
Thank you. Appreciate all the input and information you guys brought us, and Michael, thank you.
I have one quick thing, and that's just, I'm not sure it makes much difference, but will the amount of growth we might experience with more people coming online for the water and sewer be taken into account?
I believe that's taken into account with the revenue analysis, yes.
And one thing that may happen, and we've not really had a chance to talk about this, is the capital projects. I was sitting here thinking about it. If these projects are going to lead to more growth than we're currently assuming, then we need to factor that in as well. And obviously, more revenue is.
Well, and I like the fact that you're looking at the change in the not giving it away for free, because that essentially those people who don't use as much water will get a break, whereas the people that are big water users will have to pay more, which is, I think, more equitable.
It is more of an equity issue, yes, sir.
We're not really giving it away for free if you go back and look at how we got where we are. We used to charge for what people use, and then we said, oh, no, we're going to, because of the absentee owners, we're going to charge a flat fee, and basically that fee was intended to pay for that $3,000.
Right.
We had that minimum coming in every
And that's kind of what I was asking you. Could you refresh our memory on how, not right now.
We can bring that back to you.
Yeah,
yes.
because I don't even remember now. Somebody asked me the other day, I don't know, but I know there is a minimum fee. But I want to thank you guys. I mean, you have really broadened my horizons on how all that works. And just know it's our job to break it into nuts and bolts. But thank you so much for everything that you've presented. And I know you've done a lot of work on it. So good job.
Thank you.
I believe the next item is Ed's, and that is a discussion of the Phase B project. And I'm going to step out for just a minute and talk to these folks and then come back in.
Looks like we're taking a break.
Apparently, the mayor has left the building. No, he's left the room. I'm sure he'll be back shortly. And we lost Steve. So. Yeah, we still have the Mayor Pro Tem. We can go.
Don't want to forget.
It's enough to make your head explode. Yeah, he left. The mayor left. You're in charge,
All right, let's go.
Madam Pro Tem.
I can move forward, or?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. They'll be right back. I
Those
think.
quick studies.
What I have for you is just really an update on Phase B and some discussion on where we are now in the process of planning and engineering. Our engineer is planning a scoping meeting right now to determine how the stormwater infrastructure is going to be designed, engineered, and approved. One thing that he asked me on a fairly consistent basis is, Ed, is this the final plan, or is this how you're going back with sidewalks? Is the big issue. Every bit of impervious is going to be, has an impact on how that stormwater system is going to be designed. And what we've done in Phase B, I've got a very generic map up here showing the red where we have sidewalks. What we proposed and have shown the public over the past year or so is infilling in the blue areas. So you have over here on Charlotte, Hamlet, the 400 block is getting infill where there are sidewalks on the 200 and 300 block. And then Fayetteville shows sidewalks as infill, and then Atlanta shows sidewalks as infill. So that's one thing I'm hoping to get some direction from council. Is this the plan that you want to move forward with? I'll give you, this is on minute track in your packet. We did have a public workshop on sidewalks November 19th, and I've continued to get input from property owners since that time. And sidewalks is a big issue. A lot of them give me comments on maybe it's landscaping. One of the big things we just talked about is maintenance. If you look at our sidewalks now, some initially came back as, okay, there's a 3-foot sidewalk here. It's not. It's a 4-foot sidewalk. It's just got grass overgrown. And the sidewalks are in poor condition. So where they were existing, they do need to be replaced. But once we replace them, go back with a 5-foot sidewalk, then we can put a maintenance plan in place for a minimal fee versus going back and trying to make that cut back that 4-foot sidewalk that's existing now. Stormwater was a big issue, as you see on some of the comments up there, and so that's one thing that we're definitely wanting to design for. There's a lot of people who really like the sidewalks. You see some of the comments up there, people who love them, and then there's a lot of people that not so much. And then some people like, it sounds great, but can it just be on one side of the street?
The other side.
The other side.
The other side.
So I'll show that map again.
There's currently no sidewalks there?
Like Atlanta, I got quite a few comments on Atlanta. So you see the red, there are sidewalks up here up here near the school, but down the 300 and 200 blocks are not sidewalks.
So the purple is no sidewalks, the red is sidewalks?
Yes, sir.
Got it.
So, so I got, you know, if you look at those comments, a lot of people said, hey, can you put it on this north side because over here on the south side, we already have the lake. And then a lot of people may or may not have liked it over here because, you know, maybe they're parking in the right of way, or maybe they just have lived without it for so long that they just don't see a need for it. And some people love it.
Are you saying a lot of the red needs to be replaced too?
The red needs to, all of it needs to be replaced. We went out and had our engineer look at it and had staff look at it. It's all in bad shape. So the big question is, when we go back and complete Phase B, do we want to infill these sidewalks? It's included in the plans now, and it's in the engineer scoping meeting to account for these, and that's going to be in the next few weeks. He's going to be meeting with the state.
And are they currently 4 foot?
Most of them are 4 foot. You know, we've replaced up here on 5th, we put a 5 foot. So the standard's 5 feet, so design to go back would be 5 feet.
But you haven't been able to maintain the 4 foot.
We've never had a maintenance plan for maintaining
So it
them.
will be more than,
So it's something that we look at. Our landscape contractor goes and does some maintenance on our right-of-ways.
all those that have not been maintained, I've been chewed out about some of those. I wasn't even on council. I was just campaigning.
So that's, let's see, let me get back to, also, one thing I'll bring up that we're looking at now is we are still reviewing what we have from the surveyor and engineer. What this spreadsheet shows you is we went house by house and looked at how the driveways are accounted for on the survey and engineer's plan. A lot of them were missing. So we wanted to go back house by house and make sure that there is adequate access when we go back with Phase B, because we had several issues with Phase A, and make sure that we're putting driveways or a driveway apron back where folks are accessing their property. Now, there's several issues that have come up with going through this, and that's why after going through that, we also wanted to establish a policy for driveways, and I put some bullet points. We don't have a formal policy. I know it's 2016, but we've never had a formal policy or ordinance on driveways, other than if it's a driveway, it has to be 6 inches in depth in concrete. So outside that, there's no ordinances or policies for the town. One thing that we typically do, I have up here in design, is in the first project, we put the aprons from the edge of the street to the sidewalk or to the multi-use path. We continue that process in Phase B. Also put in there, our standard practice is with new development, you put the driveway back, if there's not a sidewalk, from the street to 5 feet in or to the right-of-way, whichever is less. We could, so that's a question as well. If you wanted to, we could go as far as going back to the property line.
I mean, standard practice, based on my experience, is the driveway cut goes through the sidewalk. And you don't pour up to a 6-inch apron up to a 4-inch sidewalk. You cut through the sidewalk, and the apron extends to the non-street side of at least the non-street side of the sidewalk. And it also tells people when they're walking down the sidewalk, it gives them indication that they're crossing over a driveway. I'm just throwing that out there.
Most traffic engineers go the other way. You want to give preference to the pedestrian, and the driver sees that there's a break there. But I've also heard traffic engineers say that way too.
Well, if you look at all our subdivisions out here, I don't know you'll find one where I would venture to say that almost all of them, if not all of them, the driveway cut goes through the sidewalk.
Well, and
That's what I was saying.
two, for the simple fact that if you're just going to pour the sidewalks at 4 inches,
I mean,
and
you
you're
gotta
going to
take the
drive
sidewalk
over them
out
with an
to 6
automobile,
inches.
you're going to end up cracking it more than likely. So why don't you just make the driveway the cut through and make it 6 inches, and then that way you don't have to worry about the sidewalk cracking. Does that make sense?
That, and areas where we've already planned, like Fifth Street, where we do put the 6-inch sidewalk in that area, but we could do it either way. I've heard recommendations, traffic engineers, for either way. I guess the question is, how far do you want to, if there's not a driveway cut there,
Well, from a responsibility perspective, who assumes responsibility for the driveway cut versus the sidewalk? I mean, once you put in a public sidewalk, even if you put it 6 inches, are you telling me the owner's now responsible for that sidewalk?
In many municipalities, yes. In many municipalities, if there's a sidewalk in front of your house and it starts to break, you're responsible for it.
That's why I'm trying to...
I don't know what the town policy is, so, I mean...
And I think we need to understand that, because if you put it in a driveway apron, generally speaking, that's always the owner's responsibility.
Right.
The sidewalk stops on each side of it. But if you require the sidewalk to run across it, then we need to understand who, even if it's 6 inches thick, we need to understand that that's kind of no longer a public sidewalk or quasi-public sidewalk, but the owner's responsible for the sidewalk.
I can tell you, and again, there's no policy out for Carolina Beach, but in Carolina Beach, it's always, the town's always taken accountability for the sidewalk itself, but the owner has been responsible for the actual driveway that's over the right-of-way. Now, like Councilman Shuttleworth said, there are a lot of municipalities that do require the sidewalk to be maintained by the property owner. That's just...
And I'm going to tell you, I kind of agree with that, because generally, if you have a problem with a sidewalk, it's generally the person who's living there that's caused the issue. It's not somebody walking on it.
I don't know. That's where I kind of get confused, because I've seen big delivery trucks, concrete trucks or whatever, back up over a sidewalk that the owner had no control or knowledge of that at all, and was not unrelated to that piece of property. So somebody breaks the sidewalk in front of your house, and all of a sudden...
I think at that point, they need to call
To
town
break
hall.
it into two issues, for me, I would prefer, this is just me, from a design concept, to have the driveway cut through the sidewalk.
I think so.
I think it's
Just,
I think
that's
that's
fine. That's just
consistent
me.
with
I mean,
what the UP
I'll
board
defer to what Ed and planning and Michael and you guys want, but
To me, that
if I'm
makes the
waving a
most
wand,
sense.
cut
Yeah.
the driveway through it, which would get to some of these other answers. Now, who maintains...
It's different on the multi-use plan. We understand that.
Right.
Yeah.
We're talking about sidewalks.
We're just talking, that's right. But on some of these, for example, you've got homes that have no driveway cuts and no land to provide off-street parking, and we're going to allow for on-street parking? How do we do that?
Yeah.
Well, we've done it in other parts of the community, and everywhere in Phase B, there's no parking zones. There's no parking. So if you have adequate space between the sidewalk and the home, then that's the only place they could park. So, and there are some instances, walking Phase B, and we walked, either me, Mike, or Kevin walked every single lot. There are houses out there that just are older homes that are built right on top of the property lines, and the only place that those folks are going to be able to park is in front of their lot. We had a similar situation we talked about last month with Sailfish.
Right, so do those streets in Phase B, are those going to create the same problems we talked about last couple of months on the north end, which is we're trying to allow for the fire department to get through there and have to put out their...
I don't think so, because I think there's adequate right-of-way from there. You'll have your street, you'll have the grass medium, the sidewalk, and then you'll have additional grass where I believe they'll have, actually, the grass medium between the sidewalk and the street, I think they'll have enough room to park their car in most instances.
And I think for the fire trucks that have the the outboard supports and everything would be the ladder truck, if I'm not mistaken. So you'd have to have a high-rise situation to require that to be in place.
So we're okay philosophically saying if we have to have on-street parking and people are parking along the street, because regardless of whether or not they have room or not, if you allow someone that doesn't have room, the guy next door, so Tom comes over to visit, he's going to park on the street. Are we okay with that?
Yeah.
I mean, I just.
Well, I'm not sure we have any choice where someone absolutely can't park, but we certainly, I know we've had a couple cases in the past where people could provide parking, and they opted not to. They were parking on the street, and I don't think we should allow that. If they can provide parking, they should.
And that was another
The older neighborhoods like Raleigh Avenue too, back when the sidewalks were poured, the area between the sidewalk and the street was considered parking. And that's, if you go to between 4th and 5th on Raleigh, that's the way it's set up. And that's because there's sidewalks there. If you go one block further west, there's no sidewalks, so that condition doesn't exist. So, and it doesn't exist, the remainder of it going to the west.
And we took that into account when we went and did our walkarounds, is, okay, how is the property owner using that property? Meaning the property that is town property, the right-of-way, and also their own property. Do they have a cut-through where it looks like they drive on the grass because they don't have a driveway cut to back beside their house? Do they have the capacity to have that parking? If they did, but they just never had a driveway apron, we factored in putting in a driveway apron so they could do that, thus making it so they wouldn't have to park on the street. In the cases where we couldn't because it was too tight, the yard didn't work or something like that, there were always other options, like they can park next to in the grass strip and only stick out a little bit into the street. On top of that, we're talking about going from most of these streets at an 18-foot asphalt width to 20-foot, which is the standard now, so we're already doing that a little bit. So there were things like that that we took into consideration.
So in addition to talking to those unimproved property owners about where they want their driveway cuts, and if they want one, where we see that grass driveway or gravel driveway, we probably ought to be confirming with them before we put a driveway cut into that's where they want their driveway cut, just to keep us out of dispute.
Most definitely.
If you don't, you end up with a 4-inch sidewalk.
No, I'm saying they may opt to do this driveway. Yeah, well, now that you're doing this reconfiguration, we wanted the driveway on the other side. It's
right.
Was there a requirement with the town roads of how much you have to be off the edge of the pavement? Because it's a DOT and state road, and you have to be, like on Ocean at 35 miles an hour, you got to be 17 and a half feet off of the edge of the road before you start the sidewalk.
There's no requirement on town streets, but it is, if we were talking about a state street
the
with a 50-foot.
requirement I've been given by the police department is that there's if it's blocking traffic or emergency access, then they'll address it. I think is what they've done in the past, but if it's not blocking anything, it's not causing any
Well, you can't park,
obstruction.
you don't want the citizens to park on top of the sidewalk. That defeats the purpose of the sidewalk.
We currently don't have anything in our ordinance that says how far away from the town right-of-way or the sidewalk you have to be when you're parking.
Right. I just know on Ocean, if we put sidewalks on Ocean, I won't be able to park a smart car, much less my car.
And
Because
for
you think the sidewalk has to be 17 feet from the edge.
No,
of
it
the
does on the state road.
It has to be 17 feet from the edge of
17 and a half feet. I talked to DOT myself.
From the edge of pavement?
From the edge of pavement. That's at 35 miles an hour. They want if there's not a big ditch, they want distance for the protection of the pedestrian on a road that's 35 miles
And the only
an hour.
ones
That's
that-
a very substantial problem if you're trying to do a state road.
yes, in this case, we're not talking
Ocean
about.
and Lake Park, but I don't know how you
We-
can't do that on Lake Park.
We only have 3 state roads, Dow, Ocean, and Lake Park.
That's it.
And all those, if we did anything with NCDOT, we would have to work with NCDOT.
Oh, and they
But
will not-
for residential, which
Yeah,
is where,
that's
what
different.
we're talking about, town residential property, we don't have anything that restricts us like that.
I just kind of want to make that y'all aware, because
Oh, yeah,
people
no.
don't realize that that's a problem, because I had to
Yes.
find out the hard way.
Keep going, Ed. I'm
The,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
And I've talked to DOT engineers as well about a 50-foot right-of-way and installing sidewalk with a 20-foot asphalt. Under their standards, you can't do it. You can't meet it, and because of, unless you put the speed limits down to like 5 miles an hour, that it doesn't work under their models.
No. And they don't change them.
So I think
I got to tell you, I mean, I just looked at all those streetscapes from DOT, and we've got sidewalks in 50-foot right-of-ways on DOT roads.
That's because they slowed the speed down on a lot of them whenever they put the new landscapes in or streetscapes.
They're not 5 miles an hour. I think they were 25 and 30. They
We're really not talking about NCDOT roads here. We're talking about town roads that we can pretty much adjust as we see fit.
Yeah, it's only the DOT roads, and those are only the three you've already mentioned, so.
So we keep continuing to go through these. The homes that do not have driveway cuts and do have land to provide off-street parking, we're going to communicate with those folks and find spots. Most of them have a spot where they can get onto their private property and park their vehicles. Now, some of them are going to be challenging because some of them you can tell where it was initially designed that way, and now they fenced it off and they're just parking in the right-of-way. So it's going to be, in a lot of situations, some tough conversations with these people saying, hey, you need to start utilizing your property to park on. But that's our plan. And then homes that have no driveway cuts and no land to provide off-street parking allow for on-street parking.
Let me back up just one real quick.
Sure.
On your requiring to put in the driveway, do we still have in the ordinance, driveway has to be of a certain construction? In other words, they can't just say we're going to park on our grass. They actually have to put a driveway in.
For Phase B, we're actually installing
Anything-
these aprons.
Anything in the town, I'm talking about the apron. I'm talking about when you say, there's a difference between saying, we're going to put an apron in for you, where you used to park on the grass. But if you're going to, or you didn't used to park on the grass, we're going to require you to park on the grass, but our ordinance says they have to have a driveway, correct?
Where
We
we,
changed the materials for it a while back. It could be semi-impervious or whatever, but it still requires a driveway, so it's more of a discussion than just saying you're going to have to park on your grass. Is that correct?
I think so. I think I'm following what you're saying. Yes, they would need to have in this case, since we're the ones going and doing the infrastructure improvements, when we talk to them, they will end up having, if they're going to park on their own grass, they're going to have a driveway cut
Concrete,
or a
gravel,
driveway
whatever.
apron that meets the standards that we applied, 6 inches thick and this type of concrete and so on. But that is something that the town will take care of with the construction of the project.
And that would be only, so my question is, with new construction, that's a no-brainer.
That's a
But when
no-brainer.
you go back to an existing house that's not currently parking on the grass, and we're saying you have to park on your grass, is there going to be a different standard there?
It wasn't our intent to make a different standard in that regard. We do realize that those conversations may be difficult. We may have to go and back up and punt and find other solutions for those individuals. We're not just point blank saying you're getting it and this is the way you're doing it. It's got to be a conversation.
Right. It would seem that if you don't make a driveway cut, and they're all right with that, if you don't thicken up the sidewalk, when they drive over it to get to their grass, they're going to tear up the sidewalk.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we've literally walked all these streets and picked out the ones that we could visually see, hey, you're driving on this, and this is what we need to put in place, and then we'll have that conversation with each property owner. That's the intent.
The next one down here, undeveloped lots have not, all these are most of this area is single-family, some mixed use as well. If it's undeveloped, it hasn't been approved for a use, we're not putting in a driveway cut. So that they will remain as a vacant lot. When they come in to develop the lot, then they can fix the driveway where they want it on the property. But
we'll do the apron.
no, sir.
they'll do
There's
their
no. If there's no development there, then there's nowhere designed for an apron.
Yeah,
Well,
I'll
we
tell
can
you.
do the apron once.
When they do design.
Well, that's why having the apron go through the sidewalk helps you in this scenario.
Right.
Because when they develop it, they cut the sidewalk and put the apron in. You're not having to go back and thicken the sidewalk, or take it out and put a thicker sidewalk in. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think that works well.
Yeah,
I think
I agree
a
with
whole
that.
lot more than I would be to put the sidewalk in and try to build a driveway around it, or through it, or whatever.
What I'd like to do is take some of these bullet points and put them in a formal policy, and it might be that we really need to look at an ordinance for some drivewalk standards. The last one down there is drivewalk maintenance. That's how it typically works in communities, and it has typically worked in Carolina Beach, is that you're responsible and accountable for your driveway, even the portion that goes over the right-of-way. But we don't have anything that says that formally, and we need to have something in place. So if you're comfortable with that, I will continue to work on that policy procedure, moving that forward the best way we can. I guess the last thing with sidewalks is we do need final direction on, let's see if I still got it up here. If not, I'll bring it back up. But if you want to continue moving forward with the sidewalk locations as, with all the fill-in locations, all the blue, we do need to know fairly quickly. We got a scope. The engineer's got a scoping meeting, I think next week, to finalize stormwater design. And right now, he's got all the infill designed in there. If we're going to take some of this out, we really need to know if you want to remove some of it. So we've got a lot of people that like it and a lot of people that don't like it.
I think from our previous workshops that we did, it was almost a 50-50 split on who likes sidewalks and wants them and who doesn't, to the point where it really becomes more of an issue for council on a policy decision moving forward. How would you like your community to look and function? Because one way or the other, someone isn't going to necessarily want a sidewalk or has one. The areas in red that Ed showed there are existing sidewalks that are in place that we're going to have to disrupt to do the rest of the improvements, so those will go back. The ones in purple, however, are the ones where these would make good connections to other facilities. So, for instance, on Atlanta, we have a whole segment in there where we don't have sidewalks on either side. Well, we have the lake, and we have people that go down Atlanta and walk down Atlanta. If you want to have sidewalks on that segment of Atlanta, then we need to program that in. And not only does that go to the cost of the project, because you're putting in new infrastructure, but it also goes to what we have to do to meet the stormwater impervious surface standards in the engineering. It may say, if you're going to do this, you need to put in a inline ditch or something, a gravel bed or something to slow down that water, increase the runoff, or increase the infiltration of that runoff. So those are things that cost with the project. So that's why Ed's asking, do we have a general idea from council whether we want to fill things in or if we don't?
Well, with the previous discussion, we're going to have to start making decisions about what's a priority. And I think clean water and the water and sewer has priority over whether I walk on the sidewalk that's just been made, or I walk with the street. And I think that's something we just have to look at, especially when you don't have a consensus of the public whether they want them or not, and it's going to impact their personal, the way they use their personal property much more than they won't. The people that are not affected, they're up on pylons and they drive up under there. That's not a concern for them. It is for other people. So I would be one not to push the sidewalks at this time.
When you're talking about fill-in, you're talking about the open ditches and such to allow for the sidewalks?
Some of this means additional stormwater improvement because there may be a ditch there that we have to pipe to put in a sidewalk. Not every location is like that. Most of our locations are pretty darn flat, and you're just physically putting in a sidewalk, and there isn't any necessary additional stormwater infrastructure that's needed. So it's a little bit of both.
Okay, so I mean, because if you replace a ditch with a pipe, it's a whole different scenario from a stormwater perspective as far as flow versus absorption and all that kind of stuff. So
Yes.
It changes our stormwater capabilities.
And
I don't know how many-
that's
what
and
percentage
what
of
we've done to date in getting to this planning phase is we've said, okay, plan it as if we're going to put in sidewalks, and if there's infrastructure that's needed for stormwater, account for that. So that's all put into that current estimate that we had given you for Phase B.
So that way, if we add sidewalks at a later date, we don't have to do the underground stuff. Is that right?
Well, that would make it so you have all the underground stuff underneath any of the sidewalks that we would be putting in.
And if you choose not to do the sidewalks, you wouldn't necessarily do the pipe today. If you did want to add a sidewalk in the future, then Tom, you would have to go back and add a pipe.
That's right.
Right.
The engineering will change. So if we take the sidewalks off,
Take the sidewalk out, then you take some of the stormwater out.
right.
And that's a better way than doing it in preparation for later where you've got lower costs for that. But I'm just concerned with the two things with the sidewalks. One is it's going to add our maintenance costs per year, obviously. I mean, there's people that, they have a sidewalk in front of their yard. Some of people think that that's the town's business. I'm not cutting the grass there. I'm not going to trim the grass that starts growing over the sidewalk. It's not the way I would do things, but there's a lot of people like that now with just the right-of-way with no sidewalk, and they don't cut the grass. I think it's dumb, but that's what they choose to do, and that's their personal choice. But it's just adds a lot of stuff cost-wise.
And some of that is our enforcement, is whether or not we've enforced the regulations about, maintaining that infrastructure, the private property owner maintaining that infrastructure.
Are they supposed to maintain it?
I don't believe that there is, as Ed said, anything written about
There's no ordinance
the
that says they
sidewalk.
should cut the grass.
That's one thing I think with driveway maintenance, also the right-of-way maintenance. Everywhere you go, everybody, you cut your grass in your right-of-way, and there's usually a code
Always done
that follows behind that. We just don't have that.
Do other communities have that?
Yes.
Go back to that
Majority.
last slide,
I'm just thinking, while you're going back, I don't know that I hate to say this, but I don't know that we really do a whole lot of sidewalk maintenance now anyway, do we?
No,
Just
not,
saying, I don't know how much.
no,
money
not really.
that's
I
going
mean,
on.
The one with the list on it.
the sidewalk maintenance that you're talking about isn't, we don't go
We had
and
the scenarios you were considering.
trim
Okay, sorry.
Spray or,
and spray and things like that.
Yeah, you talk, maintenance, whether it's
it's minimal.
mowing and weed eating along an edging is one type of maintenance. And another is replacing them. The maintenance I hear most about is when they're broken or you have
Right.
a tree root going on it.
Right,
Those
yeah.
are 20-year maintenance
Right,
issues. Those are not
Yeah.
something annually. When you pour a new sidewalk,
That's actually 20 years of no maintenance.
Right.
Well,
correct.
this doesn't address,
It doesn't. I'm not overly concerned about lots
Yeah,
of
I'm not
maintenance
either.
on brand new sidewalks.
so, this one at the bottom doesn't address anything to do with lawn maintenance that I can
No, sir, this was specific to driveways.
So that's something else we need to,
I think
if
that's,
that's where we decide to go.
right. I think that's something we can work in at the same
And I
time.
guess we should either have the discussion or not on the sidewalks, whether you want to say that, if we install a new sidewalk, who's responsible? Is it the town? Or, there are many municipalities that say, you got to take care of it. Now, I don't know if that means replace it if or if it's snow removal.
Typically, it's not based on repair and replacement of the concrete itself. So if there's a crack, that doesn't mean the property owner has to go in and replace that section. It is typically maintenance from the aspect of trimming, making sure there aren't any trip hazards there, toys, things of that nature, tree branches, whatever the case may be. If you're in the north, it's snow plowing and things of that nature. Daily maintenance, I guess, would be a good way of putting it.
And sidewalks crack for different reasons, like Steve said, trees or whatever, or not poured properly or not compacted properly. But you can normally tell if there's a place where there's a gravel driveway and someone's pulling over the sidewalk and it's all cracked right in that one spot, but it's not cracked anywhere else. I don't know if we're going to get into a degree where we make a judgment call on those kind of things.
I think that would end up being somewhat of a individual site assessment, enforcement type issue. And if we're going in and putting in the driveway apron and it's the standard and the sidewalk and they drive over it and the sidewalk cracks, are we going to ask them to go and tear it out? No, that would be a town maintenance aspect. So, yeah, we're making some principal changes, I guess you'd say, in how we would maintain those
Just a
things.
quick question. You're talking about replacing the existing ones either way?
Yes.
Okay. And you're not talking about moving the location of them or anything like that?
Possibly, because
some-
we're talking about increasing the width.
The reason I ask that question is, I think the reason it has probably worked and that we haven't maintained is probably where they're located. If we move them too far away where there's too much grass in between, you understand what I'm trying to say? It's not going to get maintained.
I do. The intent was to go and have a designated pattern, so if it's 20 foot of asphalt, 2 foot worth of grass, and then a 5-foot sidewalk on either side, to keep that pattern like that. That way it's, one, consistent, and two, everybody knows, okay, this grass strip here, if it's an 18-foot grass strip, yeah, I can see that people get concerned about that.
Just for me to be a little more clear, we were talking about the driveway ordinance and cuts and all that kind of thing. Not necessarily, is that something that was intended to be applied to these new areas we're talking about putting sidewalks, or we're going to go in there and apply that, whatever Ed comes up with, or are we just putting sidewalks back like they are, or, how does that relate?
The cut aspect of it, having a driveway apron, a cut through that sidewalk. If there's an existing sidewalk there now, with this project, we would do that apron and the sidewalk and everything one time. And then the maintenance, daily maintenance of those grass areas and the infrastructure would be the property owners. If it is a vacant piece of property where they're not planning on developing, we'd put the sidewalk across there, and when they choose to come back and pick the location that they want to develop and put their driveway cut, they'll cut out that piece of sidewalk. So what we're really looking for is, not only are we talking about repair and replace of existing sidewalk, but installing new sidewalk where there currently isn't, to go and make those connections for pedestrians.
And I'll just make this statement because I'm sure I'll hear about it. From a contractor and developer's perspective, there's some inequity in this, because as a contractor, I have to develop a new project, I have to put in my own driveway apron and do that work and bear the expense, and the town is putting in driveways and such. And I understand there's a difference, but...
And you're right, there is an equity issue there. What we've been looking at is trying to minimize the negative impacts later on when we don't do something all in one shot, and trying to account for properties that have been there for 10, 15, 50 years and trying to improve the roadway infrastructure and the utility infrastructure. So that's where we've looked at it and said, yes, there is an inequity, but it's not significant enough to overpower that thought.
I know it's a difficult discussion. You could tell somebody they got to pay and put it in their own driveway cut when they've been there for 25 years using it.
They're right, exactly. So
My only thought on this thing is, unless we have sidewalks that are multiple sizes, then let's stick with what we've done in the past, because that's going to create less of an intrusion issue with the property owner, whether they're parking next to the street or between the sidewalk and the street. I mean, those are the issues that I see in most of the areas that currently have sidewalks, especially older ones. The cars are being parked between the sidewalk and the street. And so for us to go in there and to take a 4-foot sidewalk or whatever the sidewalk is out and put a larger or a wider one in, that means they're either going to be parking partially on the street or partially on the sidewalk in some cases.
So Gary, you're saying if there's a 4-foot sidewalk, replace it with a 4-foot sidewalk,
Yeah.
which is what staff's come back and said. If there's a 4-foot sidewalk, they're saying uniformity. They want to do 5 feet everywhere.
bring
An
it up to the existing standards and do it 5 foot all the way.
Requirements for 5-foot wide sidewalks, and you're saying that's going to cost a foot. And Gary, you're not comfortable with that.
Well, I just know how people are using the property now. In a lot of cases, they park between the sidewalk and the street. And Raleigh Avenue is a pretty good example of that, I think.
Yes.
And so, you know, if you put a 5-foot sidewalk and you orient that sidewalk with the additional portion being towards the street, then the car's either going to park on the road or on the sidewalk. And so I don't know if that's a good idea, but
Plus, the road's going to be wider.
Right. That's the other thing, Gary. If you look at this plan, for example, what Ed has up there, we have existing 18-foot asphalt. He's talking about taking it to 20 and then going from a 4 to a 5, so you're going to lose 3 feet.
both sides.
Well, you're going to lose 3 feet, right? So there is going to be, no matter what we do, if you go on 18, if you go to a 20-foot asphalt,
You're going to lose a
we're
foot
going to
and a
see
half on
it.
each side. Yeah.
We're going to see that change for people no matter what, but we're going to have the uniformity.
Well, not only the uniformity, but also the safety. I mean, part of the aspect that we run into quite often with our streets is because they're varying widths, and it may be 18 foot in this area, your lanes are narrower. So the sense of safety and how you're driving on those roads changes.
Stop right there, Ed, back down. Your Hamlet, you got currently, we're at 17, and you're talking about going 20?
Yep. For that little piece right there, you can see how it kind of bows in
So
and
if we
out.
do that, what is the town's position going to be on on-street parking then?
What we were suggesting is in the areas where there is a grass strip between the sidewalk and the edge of the asphalt, that would be appropriate place for people to park if they don't have a driveway cut in some other parking
Right, so you
area
got
for
that
their
on
property.
one side, Ed's cursor's on the one side, but the other side doesn't have that. So what are those guys going to do? I'm trying to understand. I mean, Gary, I'm kind of with just do the 5 feet everywhere. We need some uniformity and 20 feet of asphalt and 5 feet of sidewalks. You know,
I understand.
but I mean, I can live with 4, but I mean, I just, it's
I
hard.
understand the compliance issue, at least from an ADA standpoint. And
It's just, it's two people walking side by side. It's, moms and strollers walking a dog. It's, it's just, that's why they're going to 5. But I mean, we only have so much room to do it, so I get that. I'm just concerned about if we go from 17 to 20, where are we going to let people park? That's all.
In that grass strip, and some of their parking will be on that section of road that has been improved.
You've got a little indicator there that shows 12 feet of grass between the edge of road and sidewalk on part of this, but you don't show the dimension on the other side. Looks like it may be about 6 feet or so.
It varies depending on the road and
7 feet, is that what-
7 on that.
And is that just for an
12
alignment?
on
You've
the
already got
outside.
an alignment issue that you've got to do?
Yes, sir.
We're just trying to align the roads in a better fashion.
Well, and on Raleigh Avenue, there's an alignment issue. You're not going to straighten out with this.
Oh, gosh, no.
So, I mean,
Yeah, yeah, there's some that you can't control.
A normal parking spot is 9 feet wide, and that includes coming in and coming out, so
Look close.
you're not far off. Just a quick question, since if we're going to be doing an ordinance, when a developer or owner puts in a driveway cut, I think there's an assumption they take care of it. When the town puts it in, are we getting, what kind of acknowledgement, or do we have to legally get acknowledgement for them, for the owner, that they're going to be responsible for it? And the second part of that question is, if it gets, do we have any enforcement teeth on forcing an owner to repair a driveway that the town installed?
The infrastructure piece of it would be the towns, meaning the sidewalk, for instance. The requirement that Ed's talking about is that the property owner would now be accountable for that driveway apron and that section of the sidewalk. Do we have an enforcement mechanism on it? No, we really don't. Can we have? Sure. That in itself, I think, becomes a standards type issue. When is a driveway or a sidewalk too far gone? When do we start enforcing on those types of things? Right. I think initially, like Steve said, 20 years, it's concrete. Most likely you're not going to have those things pop up much, but it'd be on an individual basis, I guess is what I'm saying.
I'm just trying to, maybe if you can figure it out, but if you came and put a driveway cut into my yard, and then somehow some truck pulled over or whatever a while later on, I became responsible for it. I don't know anything about the standards. I don't know if it was 4 to 6 inches or 5 inches. I don't know how the contractor did his work. Did he compact the soils? So do we really have any? Ultimately, do we have any recourse if somebody don't want to fix it?
I see what you're saying, and we can look into that. I don't know if we've had a whole lot of discussion on that.
There's an official assumption of that by the owner. They didn't do the work. They didn't hire the contractor. They didn't camp the soils. They don't know what those construction conditions were and whether the driveway was poured at the right temperature. So there's so many variables there that they're assuming responsibility for that I'm just curious whether we had any.
I understand. We really haven't gone to that length to go through it.
And Michael, what about new construction, for instance? Will the contractor be responsible then on new construction for putting in the driveway cuts, or do we always put that in sidewalks, or is that something we would say on new construction, you have to join your sidewalks?
That would be the responsibility of the contractor or the property owner developing that property is to meet our current standards. If that is a driveway apron, then a driveway apron. If that's a driveway,
but we always do the sidewalks. Is that what you're saying?
No, we don't always do the sidewalks. Really, what you're talking about here in this area is a area that's 90% developed, that's been there for years. And the question becomes, do you want, as a town, to add in sideway connections where you currently don't have them? Why did the town put in sidewalk connections in other parts? History.
I guess.
To answer your question, I think what you're asking is that the developer's not responsible for putting sidewalks in front of their property unless it falls into one of the subdivision ordinances. So if they put in a driveway cut and there's no sidewalks, that's it. They don't have to put sidewalks in, too. The town puts a sidewalk in, and then they develop the property. They've got to cut through the sidewalk and put their driveway cut in.
The sidewalks happen first.
Right.
Just for future reference, an aerial would help me. You know, I feel like now I need to ride down the streets and look again with this in my mind, you know, because I'm not really picturing it. I mean, I know it's there. I've walked on it 1,000 times, but now I need to go back and look. So that's, and just for the most part, I like sidewalks. I think it's great. I think it encourages what we're looking for in this community and connectivity, but I mean, I need to go look.
So that's where our question has come back in, and which way should we start moving the engineer? Right now, we've moved the engineer to say, we're going to connect the segments to increase pedestrian traffic, replace the existing with 5 foot instead of 4 foot, and move through the process. At some point, if we do that, you have an opportunity then to say, okay, no, I want you to change this. And where would that come from?
I understand the debate over sidewalks with the residents, but I think it's council's responsibility to make decisions that are in the best interest with our best vision, for the town. And I lean towards seeking to continue to improve and add these features, including sidewalks. And I would probably agree we should stick with a 5-foot standard and not go backwards, go
I
forwards
think 10
and
years
figure
from
it
now,
out.
people will come into our town and say, wow, look at this.
I mean, there's maybe some other factors we have to consider, but that's my general feel, is that we should be moving in that direction.
We'll probably get beat up along the way.
As expeditiously as good planning and budget allows.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I understand the ADA requirements on things and specifications on sidewalks and everything. I just want us to be ready to handle the complaints that we're going to get when you start replacing the smaller sidewalks with the biggers, and you're taking people's usable space
Right.
away.
Well, and to that end, I'd like, because we don't have it in our packet, but some of the documents you've shown us with the individual citizens' comments, if you could email those to us, I don't want you to print them all.
They're on Minitrack, but I can email them to you as well.
Yeah, Good. We don't have it in this packet, so at least I didn't see it.
And do we need sidewalks on both sides of the street? I don't know. I need to ride and look. I don't know.
I think if you're going to put sidewalks, you need to have them on both sides. I mean, it's...
And you'll notice what we're looking at is just sidewalks connections going east and west, not the north and south streets. And the main reason for that is most of our pedestrian travel is east and west to the ocean.
Except for by the school.
Ocean, yeah.
Well, except for around the school, and you're right.
You have them on 4th, and that would be my question, why on 4th and 5th?
And there are a couple of locations where we have connections and things like that that would help for around the school. But for the most part, it's east and west.
Well, I've said this before, I'll say
This
it
one's
again. I would say in general, when you talk in general terms about adding sidewalks to the community, overwhelmingly, everybody agrees. You guys talk specifically to homeowners, so then when you start talking about that driveway
Their
going in
yard.
front of their home, the discussion changes. But that only reinforces my point that most citizens recognize that this is a betterment to the community. They just don't want the disruption, and they don't want to lose some space or use and stuff like that.
My feeling is for planning purposes, we should be looking at the 20-foot asphalt, the 5 feet of sidewalks as you have them designed from a planning perspective, so the engineer can give us some numbers before we have to get out the paring knife. And for me, it makes more sense to have the sidewalk and then the driveway cut through it so that you have the driveway apron as a contiguous piece from the asphalt onto the property, and that the sidewalk's broken by that driveway cut. That makes it a little more definable. And then in the future, if a vacant lot develops, they do the same thing. They cut right through it. They have one pour for it. So that's my direction, but the rest of them,
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think
from a planning
I agree with
perspective.
that, too. I think we're pretty much in agreement on that part of it anyway.
And what we can do, just for information purposes, is we can tell you what the additional cost is going to be for the additional sidewalks and things like that. So,
That
you know,
breakdown would
the stuff in purple, if our total for the project is $7 million, just the stuff in purple may be $500,000, and we'll make sure to break that out so you know
Any
that.
idea how many of those are going to require ditches to be filled and piped?
At this point, I don't, but the engineer has been working on this, so we should be able to give you a pretty good estimate of that. Other things that,
where we don't have ditches and we're just getting sheet flow, what is and we don't do curb and gutter, what is the intent to do stormwater? How are we going to capture the stormwater on these streets? Yeah, but how do you do, I mean,
for the,
are you going to crown the road and then do a drain system? And generally, you do a drain when you have a curb. If you don't have a curb, we're not talking curb and gutter, right?
you're not talking curb and gutter now,
So-
except for maybe at the intersections where you end up having ADA access.
Yeah, but you got Charlotte and Raleigh and Hamlet and Atlanta here. We have no curb and gutter. Everything's sheet flowing.
That's
For the
correct.
most part. We don't have a whole lot of ditches in some of those areas. I mean, these aren't 6 blocks long of ditches?
We will be able to show you where those ditches are and what ones would be filled in.
But once you fill, I mean, what are you thinking on sheet flow? Just let it flow and catch it at corners, or?
Depends on what the information we receive from the property owners regarding, do they have flooding issues from our existing streets and things of that nature. We've added in these projects stormwater infrastructure to better manage stormwater runoff from public property onto private property. So we'll put in an inlet box or something that'll direct the flow to a stormwater line that we may have that's in the street. We've done several different things like that. And that's part of what the improvements are all about, is we're trying to improve the stormwater drainage system as a whole, along with your water, sewer, transportation, and so on, as you've
If
directed.
we have no drainage system, if it's just sheet flow and we have.
We've been contacting the property owner and talking to them about what issues they've had, and also we look through our historical records on if we've gone out for flooding issues in that property, and then we make accommodations for additional infrastructure.
Okay.
At least that's what we have been doing.
Okay, so direction for the engineer will be to continue design for the sidewalks on both sides, 5 feet, and
20-foot road.
and the 20-foot road.
Right.
So,
And break out all the costs.
right.
Anything else, Ed?
No, sir.
Thank you, Ed.
The next item is an update on our emergency operations plan. If you remember, a couple years ago, we started discussing the fact that we hadn't updated our emergency operations plan in some time. I'm going to give you a little taste of what sometime looks like and what the changes are like. If you look this way, this is our existing operations plan. It's been tinkered with over the years. That's the plan that we're going to. Much more streamlined, much better explanation of purpose. Very little of it is overlap, and a lot of it is based on FEMA and state standards for how to do operations plans. So, Chief?
Is this our new phone books? Thank you.
All right.
First thing you know about me, Mayor and Council, thanks for allowing me to present to you guys a lot of work that we've been putting together. First off, I gave you guys the elected official guide. We gave it to you about a year or so ago, and I updated a few things in it, and we obviously added Mr. Bridges to that list and made sure you get one too. And it's just kind of a guide to help what elected officials' responsibilities are and things that you could do to assist us during disasters. Like Mike said, we started with, about a year ago, we started redoing our plan. And as we went through the plan update, some of the things that we ran into was the functionality of the plan. Get this pulled up here. Sorry, it's taking a second. As Mike showed you, our old existing plan was pretty robust. Some of the issues that we started redoing it was that the plan itself repeated itself multiple times. So, for example, as a fire chief, if I want to know what my roles were, it was in page 20, it was in page 40, and then on 50-some, it gave me different things that I'd done during an event. But for someone coming in from the outside or for a new department head, you really had to do a lot of homework in order to make that plan function and know exactly what your roles were. Let me get this, as soon as Ed gets this pulled up, so I don't get ahead of myself. And I'll go ahead and I'll keep moving, and we'll catch up because I'm with you guys on the PowerPoint as we go. One of the things that we quickly recognized with the plan early on was that there was no controlled copies of the plan. So what you saw was the manager's plan may have a lot of stuff that he inserted over the years from stuff that he went to. There might have been updates that we've done, and 3 or 4 of the key books got updated, but maybe your copy of the plan or maybe my plan I had in my office. So the first meeting we held and we brought everybody together, the first thing we saw was that the plan just, nobody's plan matched. There was updates that were 10 years old. There was some that was 5 years old. So that was a challenge within itself. So one of the first things we've done is we created a controlled document page in the book. And on my book right now, you guys just have a draft, but on my book you'll see it says 3. Mike says 1, 2, whatever. So once this is an approved plan, there'll be controlled documents. Everybody will be assigned a book. When we do an update, we'll go through and initial that every book got an update, and then that department head is responsible to make sure that book stays up to date. And then, of course, we got a record of whose book did get updated, who didn't. And if we're missing a book, we know who was responsible for that book in general. So that was one of the first things we noticed as we started the update process. The next thing we've done is we started through it. Like I said, we wanted to clearly define what the Mercy Operations Center done. Part of that, clearly define that role, was establishing how do we activate. So we created a tiered system of 3 levels that we activate: level 3, level 2, and level 1. Level 3 is where we're monitoring the situation. Level 2 allows the manager to start activating key department heads. Maybe it's just a good, credible threat, and we're going to go ahead and ramp it up and bring in, fire and police and operations and the manager and start brainstorming through what's got to happen during that. The next thing was going to level 1, and that's where we would fully activate and utilize our EOC to its full potential, with all the staff that needs to be in, volunteer organizations, key support staff like Duke Energy might be in there, Red Cross, those type staff. Still not coming up yet?
Something's wrong with the USB. It could be a computer. You need to try something.
Okay. Could you run try on your laptop and then dump it over to the S-Drive?
Yeah.
It'll say EOP and then come up. The next part that we went through with it was talking about our, what we said earlier was trying to get everybody up to where our organization was defined. If you look at page 17, when we talk about the roles and responsibilities for each, as you can see, we took where this was in multiple different parts of the plan. We brought it back into one narrative focus so that each person was defined by a role, whether it's emergency management coordinator, i.e. the town manager, and what their responsibilities are. So once we got each department had to clarify their actual bullets of what they felt like was going to be their role, we took the old policy and cross-referenced it. And one of the things we done when we done this plan, we just didn't totally, when we first went into it, we kind of went in it blindly. And then we realized the plan really wasn't functional. So what we done was backed up from where it wasn't functional and said, FEMA has a crosswalk that you utilize, CG 101. We took that plan and actually walked through it piece by piece. Sorry about that. So now on the screen, you guys can walk with me. So basically, and I'm down on my bullets there at the new plan, we followed that CPG 101, and it guided us through how to create a plan that was very functional. And one of the things that we saw was that the old plan wasn't tabbed out. You really had, if you wanted to find something, you just had to go to the table of contents and try to figure out where you're going. So one of the things that we did was took the plan and we broke it up in a basic plan and then supporting attachments, and then annexes and resource manual. Now with that, what we saw was with the basic plan, we put that distribution list into place, we clearly defined our roles, we made activation levels, we defined what each department was going to do, and then on top of that, we went in there and said how we're going to train on it. It defines what our training schedule will be, and then how we're going to maintain that plan. And that's the core basic plan that we went with. Now, our old plan was almost predominantly a hurricane plan. So what we want to do is get away from the hurricane plan concept and go with an all-hazard approach. So what if there was a tsunami? What if there was a nuclear event? What if there was, tidal flood and things like that? So we were able to try to break it out. Before we could break it all out, we needed to say what attachments do we need to make that work. We put definitions in there, so if you guys or any of the key staff are going through and trying to figure out, well, why does he keep saying ARC? Well, that's American Red Cross. So it kind of gives a guide to definitions and a glossary. We put our town organizational chart. That way, if we have outside resources, they can look how the town is organized and how it's laid out. Working with Kim, we updated our state of emergency proclamation, and it's in there attached and ready to go. We developed an emergency services contract. So we may have contracts in place to do a lot of things, but we don't think about everything on a daily basis. So we get in the middle of a disaster, and we need to enter into a contract with someone to do work for us. This is a generic contract that allows us to, on the fly, go into a binding contract so that we know they're going to get paid and we're going to get the services we ask for. The next part that I wanted you guys to kind of focus in on that was a big change for us is we created an emergency services timeline, and that's on page 43. When we started doing our exercises, one of the things that we saw was how do we get everybody on the same rhythm? How do we get everybody coming here and being functional during that 12-hour period so that we don't get 3 hours into the operation and somebody was supposed to be doing a task, or we were supposed to call it into the county and gave an update of situational awareness. So working with the county and mimicking their actual, what they call their battle rhythm, is how they go through their ops period. We created ours based off of theirs, and it supports what they need information for us at certain times when we want our department heads providing situational reports back to the EOC. So that's just kind of giving you a guideline of how we would roll for 24 hours. And so that everybody's on track and we're going through it. The next thing we've done was established emergency planning zones, and that's on the next attachment 45, 46, 47. These actual emergency services zones are what we call planning maps. We'll actually have these on the board, and what we've done is sit down as department heads and we designated how we would break the island up into different parts to do planning, whether it's debris management, whether it's damage assessment, whether we go into an evacuation, how we would work through those zones. And really all it done was gave us an avenue to already broke the island up, and all we've got to do now is decide what areas need to focus based off of whether it's a tsunami or whether it's a hurricane or whether we had a tornado tear through a portion of the island. On our annexes, this is where we took everything out of the basic plan, moved it over and said, here's how we're going to deal with each event. And it's not detailed, but it gives guidelines to the ones that support that. And we divide these up between department heads that would be responsible when they work through them. So basically, annexes A through H is our emergency events that would happen, i.e. like hurricanes, nuclear events, tsunamis, tornadoes, down the line. Annexes I and K is where we looked at evacuation, re-entry, how we close the bridge, and those supporting details. Annex L was one that the mayor, when we first brought this up, we talked about how can we, if people don't get off the island and we have a major event, how can we support them with what's traditionally called a shelter? Well, the county has pre-designated shelters, and what we want to look at and what we saw around the nation was a lot of communities do what they call community, I'm sorry, I jumped the wrong thing, I'm sorry. I'll jump down to Annex N, is the comfort stations. This is where we're not calling a shelter, but what we're going to do is be set up to come in and do an actual comfort station. People can come in, we'll give them the bare necessities, and our job is to provide them a way to get to the shelter. So we put that plan in place. Going back up to Annex L, that was our community point of distribution. This was also another thing that the mayor was bringing our attention, is that the county does points of distribution or pods off the island, but how do we distribute tarps? How do we distribute ice? How do we distribute things? So we actually went into what's called a C-pod, which is what we see most small communities doing, and it literally lays out how we would set that up, who's responsible for setting it up, how we're going to route traffic around that facility, and then make a flow pattern to get them in and out of the facility. The Masonboro Commons come from the old plan, and then our annexes O, which is debris management. We didn't have anything on debris management, we just had a contract. So now we've spelled out how that operations will deal with debris management and implement that contract. Annex P's damage assessment, that we had Richard work closely with the county on how we're going to provide damage assessment and report it back to the county. Annex Q come from our old plan. It was a volunteer, how we manage our volunteers, and that's the community that comes in annually, and we establish those teams as needed. And then Annex R is a plan that's kind of like coming in the near future. We're working diligently on that. This is our continuity of operation. What we also saw, the town had no continuity plan of how will we function as government if we had a major disaster. And when we started into this got a little bit deep. There's some of those that are as big as this plan by itself. So Mike's working on it, and I'm getting him plans, and that's going to be inserted in the future. But I wanted you guys, we left it in there to keep focus on it, and we wanted you to know that one of the things we're looking at is how we're going to have a plan in place to how we continue to function as a government when everything fails. Major corporations have them, banks have them. So how do we continue to pay the bills? How do we pay employees? What happens if our building's wiped out? What's our succession plan if Mike and the mayor both get wiped out at one time? So you got to have that continuity of government, and that plan is going to spell that out in the future.
He's a very happy guy when we're in these meetings, so.
That puts it in Mayor Pro Tem's hand.
Yeah, exactly.
The last part of the plan that we looked at was creating a true resource manual. So what we've done was created contact lists for critical facilities, and this is something that's going to continue to be built on as we run evolutions and work through it. Special facilities, all the way down through route alerting teams, damage assessment teams. And if you'll look back a little bit deeper in it, we actually left it where you insert the town's phone list, and what we do is right before disasters we would update that. Through working with Gil and Jennifer, they're keeping a spreadsheet of all the town's equipment, so now we've got a place that stays in there, and actually in the plan it'll spark you to go in there, pull the current list, because while we're in here at 2 in the morning making plans, we need to know how many backhoes we got, how many trailers do we have. And yes, Gil can spill that out, but Gil might be in the bed asleep. Or how many generators the fire department have? Well, the chief may not be staying in the room at that time. So we try to put together a list so that whoever's in this room making decisions can work through the plan and not have to rely on information or minimal information from each individual department head. It's all captured here. What we're going to plan on doing is bringing this to you guys at the February council agenda. With that, the thought process is, in the old plan, you approved the whole plan. And it pretty much bonded us. The reason it's been since 2007 is because it's such a process if you want to change one line in it. So the other thing that we saw, which is what the CPG 101 recommended, was you create a basic plan that says, here's your organizational structure, here's how you're going to activate, here's your key departmental roles, here's how you're going to train on it, and here's how you're going to redo the plan, and the council approves that. That's locked in. We can't go in and change anything with that, except for on they recommend a 4-year cycle that it comes back to council every 4 years. Of course, annually, the plan says, biannually, it says the manager is to review that for any key changes that need to be made. Your attachments and your annexes are what you would endorse. You're approving it saying that I like the concept, but if we run an exercise and we realize that our hurricane or our tornado part of it just isn't functional, it gives the manager the ability as the EOC manager to revamp that plan and keep it as a functional plan. And of course, our resource manual is something that's on a non-distribution list. It doesn't go out if it's not a public record document, because it will hold information like private cell numbers and things like that. So what we do is that's also something that we're able to revamp monthly yearly or every 2 years, however we see fit. So basically, when we come back, we're going to ask you guys to adopt the basic plan and then endorse the rest of the plan. And then, of course, any major change, I'm confident the manager is going to keep you guys up to speed on. Any questions? I know I was a little bit behind, and then, of course, the PowerPoint didn't work exactly how planned.
Thanks, Chief. A lot of good stuff there, and it's nice to see it all come together. Just a question. Do we have a designated PIO?
Depends.
That would be the EOC, the county EOC representative, or whoever goes there.
It all depends on what level of activation. If, for instance, in the activation, we're doing a limited activation, level 2, I may be serving as the PIO. If it's a level 3, I may designate somebody.
So
but there
actually,
isn't
let me
one.
restate that question. Is there some policy or documentation that lies that exists that states who the PIO is under what circumstance? Because you have documents here that refer to a PIO doing specific activities, but we don't have a PIO. So I'm just wondering, is there a companion understanding?
There is a PIO as an explanation of the role that they serve.
Right, right.
Usually that is chosen at the time of the event. Okay. And so, no, we don't necessarily have a PIO that says it's always going to be Kim or it's always going to be Hannah. It all depends on what role and what level of activation. Making it flexible like that requires us to go and have a PIO, so we have somebody that goes and stands up and is present for that activity. But is flexible enough.
Does the EOC coordinator assign that person?
Yes.
Yeah, Mayor, if you look on page 18, we actually addressed the public information officer.
I was looking at that. I was trying to see who would designate it and when.
One thing we've done with the plan is because the plan, it needs to be expandable. In other words, we need to be able to activate with 3 employees or activate with the whole staff. So it puts that role on the EOC manager, which is the town manager. So he may choose to hold that role, and then when it becomes overwhelming or we expand, then he appoints. And the reason it's in the plan is it gives them a guideline of what they need to do that role.
Right. I get it. I'm just saying that both in the manager's list of responsibilities, it says he's going to provide the PIO office or something to implement. So I'm sure, is it worth adding an item in there that says the manager designates a PIO officer?
We can definitely put in a sentence that
it keeps
covers
referring
that.
to it like it's an act,
I see what you're saying, that it's something truly official, that is a step you have to go through when really it's
both the
not.
council and
I understand what you're saying. We can put in a sentence in there that explains that, certainly.
I think the thing there is you and Ed won't be gone at the same time. Y'all don't plan trips together. So, I mean, if you're not here, just like it was during the rain event that we had, Ed kind of stepped in.
Right.
And so you would think that would be the natural progression on how that
And
works.
he's got a separate designation as planning director, assistant town manager. He's got separate duties.
He does,
you
and
just say that
the reason why we don't list out the individual person is because that changes. So, for instance, in the case of when I was out, Ed stepped in as the EOC manager. Jeremy stepped up and was the planning manager for that position. So it flows. We have for our staff a ranking order, but that's not something that is necessarily in the actual basic plan, if that makes
I just
sense.
think you might want to add a bullet there that says that the emergency management coordinator assigns a PIO.
I understand what you're saying. We can definitely do that.
Not the mayor, not the
And
mayor.
Mike, it does, under each role, it rolls through that if in the absence of the manager, the assistant manager, then it's in the fire chief's responsibility. In the absence of the assistant town manager, I would be the EOC coordinator. In the absence of the fire chief, it's the police chief. So we've spelled it out that if we all hit each other at the intersection coming in, we would hopefully have somebody that, it spells it all the way down to fourth in line, and then at that point, still the mayor and the mayor pro tem still.
I understand
have a
what you're
role.
saying, though, and we can definitely put in a sentence there to fix that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
This is kind of been a quick review, I think, for us, but I have a question. In the event that all town services decide to evacuate the island, have you addressed that issue yet?
It actually is in the plan. It says that we go to, it's established as an alternate EOC. So if we evacuate the island, then the town manager or EOC coordinator designates which key employees go to the county's EOC. So we would actually downstaff and go there, and we would send everybody to a safe location. And then at that point, when the island's able to be reassessed, he would send which personnel he wanted back over, and then we would start looking at needs and then ramp back up from there.
Where is that location?
It's under alternate EOC. I'd have to flip real quick.
If you mean physically where it's at,
Physically,
the
where?
county EOC is at the government center.
Well, I know that, but
Yeah.
where
Page-
would the rest of the people evacuate to? The police force, the remaining people in the fire department?
Those individuals would end up being disbanded as town employees.
And go home, go
and
somewhere.
Go home to take care of their own responsibilities unless they are needed for the countywide response. And then I would end up turning over our resources to the county for them to use. So, for instance, we may still have 2 or 3 police officers at the bridge for security purposes for the bridge. They would actually we would be falling underneath the county's activation then.
And we've actually had discussion with, we have actually, if it's an issue of flooding or whatever, we have Engine 19s, or I'm sorry, Federal Points Railroad Bridge. We've discussed with them previously, and that we would take key police, key fire personnel and bunker them down there. And then we've also discussed if it's that bad, we need to move further inland. Wilmington Fire's headquarters could definitely house up as many as we needed. They have a very large facility, and it's modern. It's built to withstand high winds. So we have the option to take key fire and police personnel, because that's really all we'd hold back initially, and move them. We would tier back depending on the severity of the storm.
Okay.
And then other key officials go to the EOC at Wilmington and New Hanover counties and stand by.
And that general concept is in the basic plan. We'll be fleshing that out because that becomes more the COOP plan, the plan of what happens when you disband all government functions. So there'll be more detail expanded into that piece, that annex.
And that's what kind of drove the COOP plan. We started talking this same conversations, and then it's where does employees go? How do you get them back? How do you pay the bills? How do you cut paychecks? So that really drove us to, we need a COOP plan to what if,
Yeah.
and then spell out when do we. I mean, we don't clearly define when do we. We kind of, look at
Has the military been involved in this at some point in time? I knew they come in to provide coverage on when you declare martial law or something like that.
Typically, that's handled from a countywide perspective, but yes, they're included in the countywide plan, which we are just a part of.
Gotcha.
Okay, I know we're running a little behind. I'm going to shoot this next part kind of quick. We wanted to just give you a real brief overview of our multipurpose room, and I know you guys have heard several times about it. So the concept was it be a multipurpose room. The training, what?
They're busting my chops, Alan.
Mr. Shuttleworth is smiling at me.
Invite me to a meeting in that room. Gary knows.
Keep going.
And I was giving you a private tour.
That's the last one I'm going to.
Okay, so we can't call it
I didn't
Steve
say a word.
Shuttleworth's room.
I didn't say anything.
All right.
I don't know anything.
So the whole concept with it is that we have the ability to train in it, conduct meetings in it, and of course have an emergency operations center. The whole setup of the room allows us to start as small as we need to start and expand very quickly. Some basic layouts, and obviously with the chairs or everything being mobile, it can move any way around the room. We've got the monitors in there that allow us to do television and PowerPoints or Web EOC or whatever we need at one time. Yesterday we set it up, and we've left it set up. If the four of you would like to go walk through it after this, but for the EOC setup, this could be. We kind of showed it as big as we want to make it, and it's kind of cluttery. But if you look at what we try to do, we can literally have a check-in when you come in the room. All of our 5 key stations with logistics, planning, operations, finance, and the EOC manager. Have a breakout area in the center of the room. And then if Duke Power shows up and needs a chair, if our debris management contractor shows up and needs a table, if our volunteer support teams come in, we can give them an area to work in. And it's so flexible, and we can rearrange this in any way we want to rearrange it. So I hope you guys see the value in that when you go over and see. Literally, we come over yesterday, me and Melanie, and it took us 10 minutes top to take this room from a classroom to what you see right there, and I stood there and took a picture. Now, of course, that's not phones and all the good stuff that has to be done, but
Is there an override for the lights in there? Is that just strictly motion detected?
No, there is an override, and it's on the far outside wall next to the door. So that's why sometimes the motion sensors don't work, because somebody's hit that.
With the EOC, I showed you guys last time, I won't spend a lot of time, but we created these boxes here that it basically has each position, logistics, operations. What it allows us to do is when I come in and Mike says, Chief, you're going to be the logistics person for this event, in my box is basic office supplies, pens, papers, paper clips, everything we need. Drop cords, surge protectors, Cat 5 cables, duct tape to cover the trip hazards. We have phones, phone books, blank instant command forms in case the power's out. Everything we need to just go in there and sit down at my table and go to work. We also went ahead and pre-printed aerial maps, street maps, our emergency planning zone maps, flood inundation maps. All those are pre-rolled in tubes, and we literally just start putting them on the wall so that we can start working through. And it's not based off a hurricane, because you have plenty of time to do that. We're basing off what was a tornado. What if something happened catastrophically, a tsunami's pending, a nuclear event that we need to evacuate the island for. So these are things that we thought of as this thing needs to be able to be set up very quickly, and that was the concept. And it gives us a base setup, and then we can kind of build from there. We also went in our shared drive and created files in there, and these files have resource folders that the employees can click on during an activation, and it has wind conversions from knots to miles per hour, hurricane categories and what those wind speeds mean, position names that are ready to be print, so we can print the whole hit print, and it prints everything in the room, and then we go around and tape up signs that says check in, break room, edit, Each position also has a folder that's got backup NIMS files, and we created those in Excel, so when you type one in, it automatically populates the other forms to make it easy for staff. And then historical documents from previous storms to help us guide us with things that may have happened at previous storms, and then any FEMA guidelines that they need to support that. Just to give you guys an idea of what we're looking at the next 6 months roughly, we got this Thursday and Friday staff will be taking NIMS 400, and if you're familiar with NIMS, there's 700, 800, 100, 200, 300, 400. So we've got all of our key staff fixing to be not as high, but as high as FEMA recommends you be to operate an emergency operations center. We got 20 people scheduled in that class Thursday and Friday. Staff's also in the process of evaluating the current room to see what we can do to make sure there's redundancy. What happens if the server goes down? What happens if computers don't work? What happens if the TV cable goes out? Do we have cable backup? All the things we need to have redundancy during a storm. And then also we got scheduled a full-scale exercise again this spring. We've done one every year for the last 2 or 3 years. And that'll be exercising all the staff again on how we function during a storm. We always like to do that right before the hurricane season, May, June window. That way it's fresh on everybody's mind. And then we've got a couple of staff already scheduled to go to Texas A&M to a week-long EOC training. It's an advanced level. It's funded by the federal government. It's not costing you guys a penny. They pay your airfare, the whole 9 yards, put you up. And you literally go in there. I've been through one version of it. Me and Ed's actually the two staff that's going first. They bring you in the room. They do a little orientation because you're supposed to already have all this stuff, and they literally dump you into real-life scenarios. And it's not just storms. They do a pre-planned event like a fair, and then there's something that happens at the fair. How do you activate and start working? Or riots, things like that. So it's going to give us that opportunity to come back and share with our staff. We're going right before we do our big full-scale exercise so we can come back and share that with all the other department heads. So that's quick, down and dirty because I wanted you guys to get everything, but I hope I didn't go too fast. Any questions?
So over the next couple of weeks before our February 9th meeting, what we would appreciate you doing is taking a look at that basic plan, because that's what we'll bring to you at that meeting to approve at that time.
Looks like a lot of work.
Yeah, that's good job.
Good job, though.
I guess you won't ever be able to fine tune it unless something really happens.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I think the chief brought up an interesting thing. You know, for hurricanes, we have plenty of time to prepare and get ready. But something like a tsunami, you're not going to have the time. And so, you know, you may be wanting to work on something of that nature that you would be a hurricane, because, you know, there's people, even in your assessment group, that have been through that portion of it. But something that's going to happen real quick, I'm not sure how. I don't know how you would prepare for that.
Right.
So.
And I think what we're going to do, because we're finishing up the 400, we're going to probably go ahead and run a full scale of some storm or something, and we might even do a tornado this year because it's all the same functionality. We did include the tsunami plan. It's actually the county's plan, but it was designed for all the beaches. We also have, the fire department's doing nuclear, fire police are doing nuclear training in February with the plan again. We do that every year. And there's some call routing we do with evacuating islands. So that might be a good little quick wrap-up thing we do with key personnel.
One of the issues we had one time, the ships caught on fire over at the same point, and that was a quick event. I was called, I was off the island at the time, and I was called by the mayor and said that you might want to come back. We may be evacuating the beach. And so
they were within an hour, I think, Friday, from what I was told.
It was close.
Pulled the trigger on evacuating a large area.
And in that particular case, you know, if you're on the western side of the island, you want to go to the east side. If you can.
That was all we had for the emergency operations plan. We did have time set aside to talk about Muni Code and the changes to the code itself. We're not going to get to that, obviously, today. What we do want to make sure that we get to, though, is take the time to look through and compare the Muni Code book that we have in there to see what changes have been made. Keep in mind that substantive changes, meaning the town manager thinks we ought to have an ordinance on this. Well, those aren't in there. We aren't putting new things into the plan. what the plan, or what the Unicode operation does, is it goes through and it reviews all of the legal aspects of what the state requires us to do, what the feds require us to do, and what our ordinances say, and make sure that they all fit together correctly. And then we make fine tunings off of that. So for instance, if we try and keep a consistent naming convention, or if we try and say this definition means this, we want to list those things out. So those are the types of things that have changed in the code document, not so much retractions of anything or adding of anything particularly new. If you have questions on that as you go through and look at those things, please let us know. We'll be more than happy to go and sit down and talk with you about those.
So is the intent to have a public meeting and adopt those changes all at one time?
Yes.
And if there's, I'm sure you've run across, or they have run across, or whomever, some changes that are more substantive than others, that things just are conflicting with each other and such. Would those more major items be pointed out or and separated?
If you look at our code, it's some 800 pages long. To be able to go and list those things out, we had, the group of us had 3 or 4 3-ring binders going through and saying, okay, this needs to say this type thing. And Noel had one just like that. So we haven't gone and done that and tried to give you a comprehensive list that says we changed this from, this type to this type. But there are certain items that, this legislation changed, so we had to address this. Those things, we do have those.
Yeah, I would assume some things are relatively easy to clarify.
Oh, yeah.
You understand the intent, and there may be some other things where you just, the intent, you're changing the intent. So the idea is that when we approve this, we're approving all of it.
Yes, yep. So we'll add that again to the workshop, maybe put it up at the top of the workshop the next time and have that.
Well, I didn't see that in my workshop package, that's why I was.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Well,
It's on the,
there is, because it's so large, we only printed out one document, and it is in the council office. I didn't think that everybody wanted 800.
Kim, did you share with the other council the questions I had about finding things in those books? Did you share that same response with them? Okay. Okay, why don't we do that? I sat down and started.
Oh, he'll read it.
Trust me, I know that there's 4 of us in this organization that has read every detail, every line, and it gets long and winded. That's all we had for today. We appreciate you taking the time and staying after. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Need a motion to adjourn, all in favor?
Aye. Well done, Mayor.
Nice job.